Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode, it's that atypical film known as Life of Bryan. On Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema, letter by letter. For each episode of a season topic, we cover 6 films that fit a C for classic, I for indie, N for new, E for egregious, M for masterpiece, and A for atypical. Because who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I am Thomas, and you know what? I do think the cheesemakers are quite blessed. Myself.
Hello, I'm Bryan, and I feel like I have to say this because of this movie we're covering, but I'm not the Messiah, unfortunately.
But you are a very naughty boy. I know from experience you are a very, very naughty boy. But, Bryan, we're not the only 2 people here. We have a third person coming in, perhaps a false prophet, coming in to, relay us with tales of missing shoes and gourds. A friend of mine who I've, done some podcasting with in the past. It is Miss Jael Peralta. Jael, welcome to the show.
I've come for all your myrrh. I can take your frankincense and gold, take it or leave it, but I'll take the myrrh. I'm partial to it. I like it. I'm not as good as at the pithy like one-liners. You guys are really good at that. I feel woefully unprepared, but thank you for having me.
We're really good at stealing lines from like really successful comedians and adapting them to our own dumb names, right? That's how that works. But Jael, we wanted to have you on, and we're having you on here for, our Criterion season. This is our season finale for our Criterion season, our A for Atypical. And before we get into the specific movie, I'm curious about what's your relationship to the Criterion Collection. Are you an avid fan of like actually buying up discs, or do you just do the streaming service? What's your relationship with that service?
So I came to the Criterion Collection, as many of us, as a pretentious high schooler, right? So when I decided at the age of 14 that liking movies was just going to be my thing, I had this really, really engaging like film teacher. And I don't mean like, I know whatever, alarm bells, but he was actually a decent guy teacher, right? He was just like that class that I would just go and skip lunch to, and I would just hang out in his classroom and whatever. And through him is kind of how I found like the Criterion Collection and the streaming service and all that stuff. And I just I wish I could be that person that said that I made it my personality to collect and buy up discs, but I don't actually have anything to play them on. So I own Inside Llewyn Davis on Criterion just because that movie means a whole lot to me and I just kind of needed to have it. But for the most part, it's kind of just I love being like that person online who's like every time they announce like what new editions are there for the collection, I'll like talk about the covers and talk about what deserves to be there and try to like make my way through the whole catalog and watch everything. But it really is just like it was an engaging way to kind of discover movies. Like I think it's really effective for like a pretentious high schooler to have a list to kind of go into because it's so expansive, right? And it only gets more expansive as time goes on. Like as far as stuff from different parts of the world, different eras. Some of my favorite movies are things that I just watched because I randomly like sorted through the Criterion Collection and watched them and I love them. Rules of the Game is one of my favorite movies of all time and I wouldn't have found it if it wasn't for the Criterion Collection, I don't think.
Yeah, that's not too dissimilar from Bryan and myself. I'll just say this much. The movie we're talking about today is kind of crucial to that for me, in that I have the out-of-print Criterion DVD from high school still, because it's very out of print. And it was definitely just the case of like, like that or Chasing Amy, just ones where it's like, I like this movie and the DVD that's out is this particular one. And it just seemed a bit different. I'll talk about it a bit more as we divulge. But yeah, how do you feel especially about kind of that out of print angle of it? We're talking about one that is currently not part of the collection in terms of availability. Do you think there's a fair amount of those that you would want to see brought back into the collection?
I get really frustrated about things being out of print. I don't like I'm tender about this in the last couple of days because, just to put a date on this, the 28 years later trailer came out a couple of days ago, and so 28 days later is back in the conversation or whatever, and people are talking about how like you cannot get your hands on that thing
Hmm.
anywhere, and how you can only get the Blu-rays or the DVDs even just secondhand and all these things, and I just get really frustrated at the idea of like being so comfortable with like letting something go out of print or choosing to pull something out of a collection of some sort. I don't like that. It makes me sad because what I don't want is to then just live in a world where like you can't get it. Like just period. It frustrates me.
It is because I'm kind of scrolling through like on Criterion's website like which ones are out of print, and there's a lot of great movies on here, and I also have that like kind of frustrating thing where you like, especially when you go to like buy a Criterion and it's like it's out of print, like there's like 50 Reddit posts being like, when is this gonna get released again or whatever, and it's like, yeah, from a preservation perspective, it is a bit sad because like even I'm sure like a bunch of these out of print Blu-rays or DVDs, I'm sure, but like have special features or just have stuff in there that you just can't like watch. And I think like specifically for Criterion, like I remember being out in the world, going to like a Goodwill or something, and like looking for out of print like Criterions because like you never know like when you're gonna like get one, or like even like I will often go to like the library when I can't find like I think that's how I watched 28 Days Later a couple years ago, and like they had my local library had a copy of Nashville, the Robert Altman movie, which is it's completely out of print, and it's like a very rare and expensive one if you want to buy it online, but they have it there in the library. You can like rent it and stuff. But yeah, it is kind of upsetting, and I know that a lot of it obviously is like rights issues, rights expire, rights get mangled up or whatever, but like yeah, it's kind of it's weird that they have just like a ton of these movies that are technically part of the Criterion Collection, but you can't really access them anywhere. Although I think they will try and like make them available on like the Criterion channel occasionally if they can get like streaming rights, but obviously like physical release rights are kind of different, I assume. So yeah, it's just a weird kind of like situation as a whole, I think.
I think the biggest sins in particular are stuff where it's like not only is it not available in the Criterion Collection, but not available elsewhere. Like
Right.
the two biggest sins to me are the two John Woo movies, The Killer and Hard Boiled, which after
Yeah.
they were released on Criterion as Spines Literally 8 and 9, not available at all in the US to like stream or buy physically. It's fucking ridiculous. I fucking hate it so much.
And it's like I just get frustrated because I'm like, okay, so what are we doing here, right? Like I just if you are supposed to be like preserving things, and I understand, like it's this thing that happens to me where I'm just like, I don't know how we got here as far as like the rights and the things. You know what I'm saying? Like because I think about, and again, I'm sorry, I only bring it up so much because it's like the most recent example that's fresh on my mind. But the 28 days later of it all is so crazy to me because I'm like,
Hmm.
it's about like the music in it. I really like I think if I'm not mistaken, that's the crux of it. So then what's the point anymore, even? Like not to get so like bleak, this like we're 5 minutes into this, not to get so like annoyingly upset about like the state of everything, of streaming, of physical media, of everything.
Especially when this is coming up the third week of January when nothing else bad is happening.
Oh, oh, oh God. Oh no. Yeah, and now like it creates this thing in me that I don't want, which is like ultimately I love that the Criterion Collection exists. It's a good thing. But then I'll look at it and be like, "Hey, look, Thief is supposed to be coming out on March 11th, 2025, but who knows? Maybe like by 2026 it'll be out." You know what I'm saying? Like I don't want to doubt it. I don't want like it's a good thing. It's preservation. It's important. But like the out of print thing is just so stupid.
It really taught me, especially when I was younger, just the whole like fact that like how things can like lack preservation even from just format shift to format shift. Like with Life of Brian and also another one I had when I was younger, Chasing Amy, those DVDs are literally ports of the laser discs. And there's just like fun things preserved on like, oh, this was from an earlier format that like don't travel on to the next thing. Like if you watch Life of Brian on this DVD, it immediately starts playing bonus features. Like it doesn't go back to the main menu like an old Laserdisc would. Or with Chasing Amy, the funniest thing is Kevin Smith loudly declaring, "Fuck DVD, Long Live Laserdisc, which I watched initially on a DVD, which is just so fucking funny to me. That like that kind of thing, like certain things just get like lost when you go from one platform to the next. There are certain movies like even from like, you know, from theaters to VHS to Laserdisc to DVD to Blu-ray, certain movies just get lost in the shuffle and don't get those like upgrades and are just kind of like lost from being able to be seen by anybody.
We talk a lot online about like the what those transfers and things do to like the colors or the aspect
Mm-hmm.
ratios or the frames or everything. I think a lot about, you know, all of these 4K restorations that kind of look like garbage of certain things when they're not done carefully or not done well. And it's just another one of those things where I'm just like, I think it's a net good that the Criterion Collection exists, but I worry that like all things, capitalism is gonna like ruin it and it's gonna destroy like it's just not gonna be effective at like, okay, no, I'm sorry. No, we're walking it back. I can't get this week. We're not, no, I'm not
Yeah,
doing
look on
it.
the bright side, Kyle. Come
Well,
on.
Yeah,
Did movies teach you nothing?
whistle, 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 because I can't actually physically whistle. But oh my God.
what I think is really interesting. I mean, obviously we're talking about Criterion specifically, but within the past few years, there have been a lot of like very small independent distributors that have like almost like not like picked up where the Criterion Collection has left off, but like a lot of stuff that Criterion doesn't get or doesn't get to because like you know they put out like a lot of movies every year and they can't cover everything, and so there's a lot of stuff that like just either gets lost, and you do kind of see like or you will see kind of like some movies come back. Like I remember kind of what you guys are talking about, like with the Wong Kar-wai box set, which those movies I think a lot of them were unavailable for like a long time. I think like Fallen Angels was unavailable, although there was the whole kind of problem of like, oh the color is different of certain movies. I think the aspect ratio of Fallen Angels is different and stuff like that. But you also see it with like Ran, the Akira Kurosawa movie, which like was just not available. It's out of print on Criterion. It's just like it was not available for years, and now I don't know who has done like the new 4K of it, but it is available. So it's like I think I think we mentioned this earlier in the season, but like although the Criterion Collection like does very important stuff, and like I think for me they were very important to get into a lot of like international films and old films and stuff like that. Like they're not the be all end all, I think, you know, and you can look to these are some bigger ones, but like Kino Lorber or Arrow like put out a lot of like really great stuff that Criterion either misses or they'll kind of do like their own version of a movie that Criterion also does. Like I think Arrow has like Parasite, I think, as well as Criterion. Like so it's a great like company and they do really, really cool stuff despite kind of like how much they've kind of lost on a lot of film rights and stuff like that. But there are other companies kind of doing stuff like this, which I think is kind of like cool, and I think is like, especially yeah, like from a preservation perspective, like is really important to just have these movies on like physical media.
I like the Criterion Collect. Like it's like you're saying, it's a net good that it exists, and a lot of the problems that we're even like getting into now, as far as like the out of print stuff or the incomplete nature of this collection, or the ways that the rights affect like the accessibility, is stuff that would happen beyond them. I
Mm-hmm.
think ultimately what is good is that like it puts eyes on things. I think you know, and I like that they've leaned into being online in a way that's not so cringy. Like the whole like the Criterion Closet stuff, I think is like really good and effective. I've gotten to a place where like I can't be so cynical about like film Twitter and all this stuff. I'm like if it gets people to watch like more than 3 movies a year. If you're not just going to the movies for Deadpool and Wolverine and Dune Part 2, if you're actually like taking a second to kind of be like, well, maybe I'll watch Silence of the Lambs because I don't know, Zoe Kravitz pulled it on her Criterion Closet thing and it went viral on TikTok. You know what I'm saying? Like I've gotten to a point in my life where
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, fine, anything that gets you watching basically anything. And I think the Criterion Collection is good, even if it just exists as like this like separate list that you can use on your own to just like pirate stuff, which is what I was doing in high school. You know, I was going on F movies to watch like Memories of Murder and things like that. Like I wasn't buying these things necessarily, but I think I'm a better person because, well, not a better person. I don't think I can be, but I'm at least more well-rounded in my interest in film because I had the Criterion Collection as something like as a guiding thing. So, and because I know people get annoyed about like those ubiquitous brands, the A24s and the Letterbox and stuff. But I think Criterion is a little less evil than those.
Right. Yeah.
I
But
say loudly, but like, I wouldn't reject a Letterboxd top four interview if it was offered to me.
as would none of us. No, we're very
Right.
loud supporters of the corporate overlords of Letterbox. Please, whatever. But let's go ahead and jump into our movie for this episode. Let's go ahead and jump into Monty Python's The Life of Brian.
This is Monty Python's all-new Life of Brian.
They call Bryan.
He was a born leader,
Brothers, brothers, we should be struggling together. We are.
a potential martyr,
What will they do to me? Oh, you'll probably get away with crucifixion. Crucifixion? Yeah. First offense.
and his mother's joy.
Been telling them? They think I'm the Messiah, Mum. I'm the Messiah!
There's no Messiah in here. There's a mess all right, but no Messiah.
And now, it's up to Brian to deliver a despairing nation from the throes of oppression. Tough luck, Jerusalem. Just when you thought you were saved. It's Monty Python's Life of Brian. He wasn't the Messiah. He was a very naughty boy.
Terrific race, the Romans. Terrific.
An objectively insane thing to be on the Criterion Collection, by the by.
Yeah, that's true. I think that's why it was appropriate for a typical choice.
Just insane.
Yeah, so Life of Brian came out August 17th, 1979, and is, of course, a film from the Monty Python troupe, British comedy troupe, that was initially famous for doing the Flying Circus TV show, which was a sketch show that aired from, 69 to 74, and then, of course, they started doing movies. They did before this, and now for something completely different, which is a sketch movie that's just a bunch of the sketches redone in cinematic form from the show, and then Monty Python the Holy Grail in 1975, which was popular enough to get them to get another movie, in this case Life of Brian, to come out, and then after this there would be Live at the Hollywood Bowl, which is like a concert movie of them performing their sketches at the Hollywood Bowl, and then The Meaning of Life in 83. And before we get into, I guess, Life of Brian, we should probably divulge our relationships with Monty Python as a thing. Jael, what is your sort of familiarity and your background with this very famous British comedy?
So, as anybody, if anybody who's listening to this has ever listened to me on the Film Cred review, they're probably like, not that I'm so arrogant enough to assume that you would remember any of my personal bits, but I talk a lot about how my parents being like Gen X immigrants kind of puts me in a weird position against pop culture, which is that a lot of people with parents around, so my parents are like in their 50s, right? So a lot of people who have parents around my age who are like in their 20s will talk about like things that the connections that they have to culture that were brought upon by their parents that I don't really have, just by nature of the way that they consume media and the things that caught their attention once they got to this country. So like, for instance, I have no nostalgia connection to like, I don't know, like the Beatles. That's like my major one. I kind of use that as like a stick, like as a major like reference point. Like I had to come to the Beatles on my own, you know what I'm saying? But Monty Python is one of the things that I came to because of my dad. My dad, it's weird. He speaks English. He dominates it quite well. He speaks it a lot, like in his job. He still works. But for some reason, in his comedy, like in his tastes in comedy, he skews very British, which I find interesting only because, British humor can be a little more talky, a little bit more like, double entendres, plays on words, and XYZ, which you wouldn't expect a guy who doesn't totally 100% dominate English to be into. But my dad really, like, for some reason, just on Sunday afternoons, he would throw on Monty Python. He would throw on Robin Hood Men in Tights. That was like a big one for him. And I, as a kid, remember him and my older sister had a lot of bits amongst themselves about like certain Monty Python things, both with the Holy Grail and specifically with this one, Life of Brian, which is my dad's favorite. And then as I was growing up, I didn't realize that we were just like doing bits from these movies as a family until I got older and then started watching them. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. That's why, like, in my house, like, sometimes we'll be saying something and then, like, to explain it, like, sometimes somebody will say, like, oh, I'm gonna have like pizza for dinner, and somebody will say like, oh, pizza, good. Like they'll be like crucifixion, good. Like that's just like a bit that we have in my house where we'll say something XYZ good, and then we have to double it up with like crucifixion, good. And like I did not realize that that was like a Monty Python bit until much older. All this to say that yeah, I kind of grew up with Monty Python like as an integral comedic voice in my household, even though we don't really have like I don't really know so much about them and their history. It's just kind of like they were always just kind of around, like those jokes and those movies were always just kind of in the background. So that's why I was so excited to talk about Life of Brian, because this one is my dad's favorite and it's the one that I've seen the most.
And by contrast, Brian, I know you're not as familiar. You've seen Holy Grail prior to this, but that was really your only exposure to them, right?
Yeah, I think I was familiar with like the like art style, which we can get into, kind of like the this movie's like opening credits, that sort of like very specific art style that Monty Python had. And I don't even think I knew that like they kind of like that it was them. I just kind of liked the art style. And then yeah, I've seen Holy Grail a few times actually. I really love that movie. I think it's so funny. But I've never really dived into the other movies, although I'd heard specifically that Life of Brian was like maybe even better than Holy Grail. It is interesting, like how what you've been talking about. Like I have a kind of a similar upbringing where my parents are immigrants. They don't speak English, and so like my dad would like on a Sunday afternoon we'll put on like TCM and watch like a Western or stuff. But I had kind of like an opposite reaction to that, where I was like, Westerns, gross, I'm not watching that. As far as kind of like my knowledge of Monty Python, I also don't really know too much about them. I know kind of like the main players that we see in the movies, and I'm pretty familiar with Terry Gilliam's filmography, although I have a bit of a rocky relationship with him. But I really love the like comedic sensibilities, like what you said about like British comedy being like it's kind of specificity of how it is. I think I really enjoy, and I think it's been one thing where it's kind of like interesting to kind of discover quote unquote Monty Python and to really enjoy it, but also to kind of see, I'm sure we'll talk about how like not just how certain stuff has aged, but just kind of like how you can see a lot of like modern comedy has kind of like spawned from a lot of what Monty Python does, and just seeing like that influence is really interesting. I still am not entirely familiar with like the Monty Python troupe, but I really like their kind of vibe and the kind of like the style of, not just the style of comedy, but like again like kind of the art style that goes into it and kind of like the visuals of it all and stuff like that. But yeah, and I know that you are very into Monty Python, so yeah, I'm curious what your kind of
what are you
is.
saying? A white guy in high school really got into Monty Python, especially a nerdy guy? Brian, how dare you be so accurate? Because yes, I was like, there was a certain point I remember I didn't really get this by contrast from like my parents. Like my dad had seen Holy Grail, I think, and that's the one that he's familiar with. That's the most ubiquitous one of like the Monty Python movies. But yeah, in high school, I remember specifically because I was so into stuff like The Simpsons and South Park and certain comedians like Eddie Izzard and stuff like that. All of them would always source Monty Python as a huge inspiration whenever I'd see like interviews or commentaries involving like a lot of my comedic heroes involved, like Monty Python. And it all goes back to Monty Python. So I was just like, I have to see the sort of the fountain from which all this genius came forth at that particular point. And especially when I was younger, whenever I got like into something, I dove deep. That's not really changed as much if you watch my letterbox and see like any of the research I do for these fucking episodes, where it's just like, oh, let me be a connoisseur of just bullshit. And with Monty Python, that was definitely the case, where I definitely watched like the major movies, but then also I would make sure to like watch BBC America when they would have Monty Python reruns. I would buy like DVD box sets of the obscure stuff. Like I bought literally a box set that had like some documentary stuff, but also like there was a point where they went to Germany and reshot a bunch of sketches in German for German audiences. I had DVDs with that bullshit on it. I didn't speak a lick of German, but I was just like, it's Monty Python, I gotta watch it. I gotta read this huge book that had like all like the history stuff, so I'm well aware of the bullshit history of like, oh, these guys went to like Oxford and Cambridge and then started working for the BBC, and certain people became writing partners like Graham Chapman and John Cleese, and then Terry Jones and Michael Palin also on the other side of it, and then Eric Idle kind of helped bridge the gaps between them, and then Terry Gilliam as well, who's the one American. So I know all the bullshit history as well of like Monty Python and stuff like that, and I think it did really help shape a lot of like my comedic sensibilities as well. It just in the fact that like it was just this weird absurdity that I found so fascinating. They've said as much that like there's not as much of that in America. Like the closest connection they kind of had to like their sensibility was like a Mel Brooks, which I think is apt. And if you watch like some of the Mel Brooks stuff, it has that kind of comedic absurdity. But he's much more based in like Borscht Belts, like very broad American stuff, versus the absurdity in a Monty Python bit is so genuinely out of nowhere. Like their famous thing is like the foot that comes crushing down. Like, that's the kind of absurdity of Monty Python. It's just like, they will literally, like, if you watch an episode of Flying Circus, there would be points where they would just let a sketch go on for as long as they could sustain it, and then when they didn't have any idea of how to, like, go past it, someone would blow up, or the giant foot would, like, squash them, or shit like that. That's the way they would get out of sketches and move on to the next thing, this weird, like, stream of consciousness element of it. And I think that's very much the case in, like, their early movies, like, And Now for Something Completely Different, given it's so based in the Flying Circus stuff, has that kind of, like, stream of consciousness element to it. And Holy Grail, despite being like a really great movie, is barely a movie on like a structural level. Like there are characters who recur and go throughout the story, but it's mainly sketches kind of tied together with the loosest story possible. Versus with Life of Bryan, you can tell that this is the one that, at least to me personally, feels like an actual movie, in that you can see like the sketch kind of like material stitched together. But at the same time, this is the one that feels the most like an actual story, as opposed to just like, and now for something completely different, or foot coming down. Even though there's a bit of that absurdity in there, for sure. But it's much more kind of streamlined as a story.
That kind of like, almost like randomness to like some of the ways that they either end a like, because there's various kind of like scenes in this that just feel like a sketch. And then, like, it kind of cuts, like at the end of a sketch, like on SNL or something. And, I mean, there's one moment, which we'll talk about in this, that I did not know about. And I think is one of the, like, most insane things I've seen in a movie. Because I just wasn't expecting what this movie was. Or what happened, in that specific moment. And, it's true what you say about, like, Holy Grail being this kind of very loose, barely hanging together kind of movie. Which is kind of what I do like about it, though. I do like that it has that kind of like loose kind of structure to it, and I love this movie as well, and as we'll get to, but I still really kind of love how kind of almost like improvised and like just like and this movie has the same feeling of like being held together by like tape and bubblegum kind of thing, and like it feels like a group of people kind of figuring out just like what to do, as opposed to a kind of real structure to this thing. Like, you really don't even have like, maybe you can shed some light on this, but like, it doesn't seem like any one of them is the kind of like leader necessarily. Obviously like Gilliam has like a long career, so does John Cleese, but like, it doesn't seem like Gilliam was kind of like the leader of the Monty Python, neither does John Cleese or anything like that. It feels kind of like a real collective, which I really love, but I don't know if it is different than that.
No, Gilliam was just the freak that was off on the side doing animations, would occasionally pop up in sketches, really.
Right.
Like, he was really not that involved necessarily. And I guess Cleese was more of kind of like the star in that he had the biggest comedic kind of reach with the BBC at that point, with stuff like The Frost Report and some other things. He was a bit more of like the famous face who kind of got Flying Circus to be a thing at all and just brought everybody with him because he liked their sensibilities. But yeah, it's also just interesting, by the way, with Monty Python in terms of like the cultural thing Jael was talking about, which is like her family. On like a wider cultural level, you see so much of like particularly internet culture in Monty Python with certain things. Like, the reason spam is a thing in internet parlance or emails and shit is because there's a Monty Python sketch that's about somebody going to a restaurant and every single menu item has spam in it. And the person's just like, I don't like spam. Get it out of here. I don't want it. And that's why spam's a thing. Because nerds were just like, oh, let's make this the thing for when you don't like this email and you want to get it out of here, you put it in the spam folder.
It is fascinating, the outreach of Monty Python, because I, as a kid, and I'm talking about like very small, was like kind of like the pivotal, like where we were watching more Monty Python than anything. And then I got a little bit older and I hadn't watched Life of Brian in a minute. And as I'm watching it, what I started remembering was how a lot of the more famous, more unfunny people on certain circles of YouTube, for instance, kind of stole a lot of their shtick from Monty Python. Because I started remembering a lot of like nostalgia critic bits and the way he would
good
structure
Lord. Yeah.
his. But
Yes.
am I crazy? I'm not crazy, right?
No,
like
you're
it's
not.
a lot
No.
of it, like, and some of it was like intentional, some of it was like intentional references, some of it was just like, no, he's just trying to steal bit for bit, bar for bar, like
Yep.
how they would do stuff. And listen. Is this a safe space? Who's to say? I don't know. But I will say this. I watched some nostalgia critic growing up, right? I think it's kind of a natural end product when you're a kid and you're interested in film and stuff. You end up on those circles of like people talking about movies, and if you were of a certain age, that was the nostalgia critic. And so it's weird because now I go back and I'm watching this movie, and as I'm watching it, I'm like, oh, I remember some stupid like bit where he kind of did this same thing, and like, oh, now there's aliens, and oh, now the foot comes down, and no, now someone blows up. But it isn't funny. If you want to go back and like watch those things, it's not funny anymore because I'm not 12.
And it's also not 2008 or whatever when that was
It-
supposed
you
to be
know-
allegedly funny. When I also found it funny. I'm not against it. I'm with you. In terms of, I also watched that bullshit, unfortunately.
I listen. The other day when Smiling Friends brought him on, I laughed. I can't deny that part of my history. It's what makes me who I am today. I don't get here without the nostalgia critic and the nostalgia chick. Unfortunately, we got to get there. We got to get to where we're going. But it is crazy that you say that, Thomas, because even something as simple as like I could totally be off here, but the whole like using the coconuts for like the horse, the hoof beats thing. I'm pretty sure that was a joke on like Avatar: The Last Airbender at some point. Like when they're
Yes.
watching the Ember Island
yeah.
players, things like that, where like it's kind of like, for me, it's like the Matrix, where I've had conversations with people that will watch the Matrix as an adult and then be like, oh my God, so all of these different things and all these references and all of these jokes were all about the Matrix the entire time. And I'm like, yeah, like it's this weird pervasive thing where like the whole culture kind of takes all these things and you don't even remember what the source is. And it's just so strange.
Because Monty Python, is at this point a bit older, right? Like, it is so ingrained and so baked into like what comedy is and what a lot of like modern sensibilities of comedy are, both like British and like American and other types of comedy. And it's like you mentioned the Beatles, and there is a Beatles connection in this movie, but it is kind of
Yes.
like it is like the Beatles in a way, where like you can listen to the Beatles but you kind of can't wrap your head around just how influential they still are, like to this day. Like bands and musicians in 2024 like release music that is, you can make a direct connection to the Beatles, and it is kind of like hard to kind of almost like wrap your head around how big of an influence that is. And especially like, as we're talking about the Beatles, like George Harrison is an executive producer on this movie and helped a lot of is it called Handmade Films?
Yes, Handmade Films, which was like his production company, was basically created for this movie because it was originally, I believe, EMI was supposed to like produce this, and they backed out at the last second where they're like, wait a minute, a religious satire, we'll lose money off of this, so they backed out, and then George was just like, oh, I'll join in, sure, I'll give you some money. I'll create a whole production company. And like they were so grateful that he's in the movie very briefly. Like when Bryan's getting led through like the big swaths of people, they're like around like the Judean People's Front's like hideout, and they're all just around. There's the one guy just like, oh, and here's this guy, and it's just George Harrison like, hello, and then he disappears. It's a very funny cameo. But yeah, that's the thing, is it's also just weird even with like the way that those people ended up crossing over. But the connection I ended up having when I realized when I first started watching like some of these movies was like, oh yeah, Eric Idle and John Cleese are in like every other fucking kids movie of the 90s. Like we talked about Casper not too long ago, Bryan.
Oh yeah.
Hello, Quest for Camelot.
Quest for Camelot's another example
That's
of that.
where
Yeah, look,
I come in.
yes. No,
Do
that-
you
that's,
want a
that's
5-minute Quest for Camelot corner? Because I got you. Don't do that. But yeah, I hear that voice and I react very quickly to Eric Idle's voice specifically. It's funny because you mentioned like, oh, John Cleese and Terry Gilliam, they're the most famous ones. But for me, in my house, it's Eric Idle, which is so crazy. If we're talking about this like K-pop terms, where you have like your bias, you have your favorite. This is an Eric Idle bias household.
Well, I guess that's also a question, too, in terms of the group. You would say Eric Idle's your absolute favorite of the group. Why is that exactly, beyond, like, even the nostalgic connection?
So, as I keep saying, my family and I, we do these things, probably just the autism, right? My family has this thing where if we find a bit, but it's not even about the words that are being said, it's the way someone says it. We have a lot of bits in my house where we're repeating, like, lines of dialogue from movies, but not because they're laugh lines, just because we like the sound of the way they say it. And Eric Idle has this type of voice where I just think everything he says and the way he says it is just funny to me. And like and a lot of the lines of his that I remember from Quest for Camelot are specifically just because I just like his voice. I just think he's funny. It really doesn't get any more like basic than that. It's just like I don't know. I like his voice. He's silly.
He was probably the first person I fully recognized as specifically British. Like, when I was younger, watching stuff like Casper, and she's like, oh, that's a British person. That's a very British motherfucker
And
right there, yeah.
he's the voice of my child, because he's also the narrator, Ella Enchanted,
Yes.
which, yes, Bryan, I know this. Ella Enchanted. Now, do you want the Ella Enchanted corner? Because that could be a 15-minute corner. Hello. Do you want to have the, oh my God, what's his face? What's his name? Wesley from Princess Bride.
Oh, Carrie Elwes.
Yes. Do you want to have the Carrie Elwes, Ella Enchanted Best Supporting Actor conversation? Because we can go there.
We'll bring you back for the Ella Enchanted episode. We'll eventually
Absolutely.
do. Don't worry. We'll eventually, I'm sure, do that.
It's also just really fun to look at this cast list and to see like the commas of like Eric Idle as Mr. Cheeky, comma Stan / Loretta, comma Harry the Haggler, comma. Like, it's just amazing.
Idol in particular is so good at that Mr. Cheeky thing, which is like, oh, step up a lip, chip up. What are you doing?
I
over
love
there?
it.
Like that.
I
Oh,
love
he's
it.
so good at it.
That's my favorite type of British to do. Like, it's so, hey, though, isn't it? Like, it's just so stupid. Like, you people actually talk like that. That's insanity. Like,
Yeah, especially if you watch like the Flying Circus sketch Nudge Nudge, which is all about Eric Idle trying to insinuate to Terry Jones about like, oh, you fucked somebody, right? She's like, know what I mean. Pip pip cheerio, you know, Ryan the How's your father and the Dickie Birdie, like doing those kind of fucking British isms. So good, yeah.
I mean, it is like one of the things about like when I first watched Holy Grail, and like again, there's stuff from Holy Grail that like it's just a flesh wound, like, you know, stuff that just kind of like, you know, just from like cultural osmosis. But watching that movie, like, and watching this movie, it is kind of like amazing how these like 5-6 guys are just in so much of this movie as different characters. And for me, at least, as someone who like I can kind of differentiate between all of these white British men, but I don't always like know who's who. And there are times when I kind of like, oh, behind a beard and like a long hair or whatever, that's John Cleese. Like, I could tell that. But it is just kind of crazy how much these guys are doing in this movie and how kind of seamless it is, right? It's not like they're making it very obvious, like, yes, it's me, John Cleese, in this wig again. Like, they're really just doing all of these different characters, and it's very admirable. And I love how much they're able to, like, I mean, one of my favorite bits in this movie in particular is when all of the like women get beards to go to the stoning, and they like the voices they all do is so funny to me. Especially Terry Jones as Bryan's mother, I think is like my favorite. Just him doing the like high pitched kind of voice. It just like gets me so much. But yeah, just it's just really like amazing how they're able to all of these different roles and just kind of yeah, I don't know, it's wild.
Who would you say is your favorite, though, if you had one, Bryan?
It might be Terry Jones because of what is the mom's name? Does she have a name?
Mandy.
Mandy.
Yeah.
Like every time like she shows up, especially when she's doing her bit like at the window where she's like 1 minute, it's just really really like funny, and his commitment to I'm playing an old woman is like really funny.
I love like he has this great ability, especially to like have these characters who are sort of stuck in their position in life. And especially in this movie, there's a bunch of them where it's like, oh, they kind of find a new lease. Like, I love the old bearded guy that Bryan runs into who's had the vow of silence. And he gets stepped on his foot. And he's just like, oh, damn. Oh, no. Well, I guess it doesn't matter anymore. I'm alive.
The reveal of like how long his beard is when he like gets out of the hole is so funny.
I'm just sitting here in the background, just like because I'm just like remembering as we're like just talking about it. I'm like, it's such a good time because it's kind of like it's all so absurd and not like on paper in 2024. If you say that like the funniest thing, the thing that made for some reason, and I remembered it very well, the stoning, because we make jokes about that. Again, in my, I'm gonna be, you know what I'm turning into? You remember that guy from BuzzFeed that ended up getting fired because he cheated on his wife and he made his whole brand being a wife guy? And anytime he opened his mouth to talk, he would just be like, my wife. I'm turning into that about my family. And like, I need to stop before I get like disowned or something. But the point is that unfortunately the stoning is also a big bit in my house, which is like just anything, like all those jokes about the stoning. So I knew that was coming. And yet when you say on paper, the scene is just a bunch of guys wearing beards but pretending to be women, pretending to be men. Like, it shouldn't be that funny, but it is. It's so funny.
For me, I have to say, I think consistently, like, I remember when I was younger, I was probably more of a John Cleese fan in terms of just, like, the way he's able to kind of, like, rattle off certain bits. Like, he's very good at rattling off, like, the whole scene where he's talking about the Romans. Like, what have they ever done for us? It's like, apart from the aqueduct and and the roads and all this other stuff. He's good at that. But I think as I've gotten older, Michael Palin's my guy. I think because Palin is so good at playing, like, the most versatile roles, I think. He just has the ability to play, like, assholes or the nicest charming person or a complete moron. And especially in this movie, there's so many different layers of that. Like, I love, probably my favorite of his characters is the ex-leper, who comes up to Bryan, just like, oh, you know, Jesus cured my leprosy, but he put me out of work. I can't beg no more if I'm not a leper. And he's just like bouncing around. He looks like fucking Tarzan too. That motherfucker looks jacked. It's so funny seeing him like bounce around and be like bitter about the fact that he got cured of his leprosy and can't get money anymore.
The ex-leper bit is one of those things where it's like, that is the type of humor where like, how do you eat, like, because it's true, like for me the part of that scene that makes me like cry every time is like without so much as a by your leave, and just that phrase just like really gets me. I don't know why, but it's that, like, this is the thing I'm talking about where I'm like, I don't understand why my dad, who like barely, like not barely, but like who doesn't really, like didn't really grasp, and like British English especially, my parents are Dominican and they'll be the first to tell you they've gone to England several times and they're kind of just like, these people are speaking Creole, I have no idea what's happening here. Like, and that whole thing where he's just like, he's spouting off all of these weird Britishisms and he's hopping around like an insane person. And it's like, I had to rewind a lot because, you know, I'm watching without subtitles. So I had to kind of like just rewind a lot to kind of take in the words. But it's just too funny. Like, a lot of the physical humor, I think, is something that like gets kind of lost in like the legacy of Monty Python, which is just the way these people are moving their bodies and the things that they're doing to each other. Like again, I'm sorry, I keep going back to the stoning. The like rapid fire when he keeps saying Jehovah and like all of the rocks just like pour onto him all at once. It's just, it's too much. It's too funny.
And I love it's even like little subtle things as well. Like with Palin has another great character when they're having like all the different like false prophets. And there's like the raving mad guy, and there's the guy in the red outfit that seemed like more traditional. And Palin plays the guy who's like in a beard and he's got like a little sack over him, just talking about like, and one will forget where one put another person's hammer. People will forget where their fathers put their hammers. And he's just doing like small little bits with his hands to indicate like what's going on. And it's just like, even like small subtle stuff like that is so fucking funny because these guys are just like incredibly natural performers and writers, which I think is the big thing. The fact that these guys both wrote and performed their own material, I think really works, and you can see like their comedic sensibilities playing off each other, but how they specifically own like whatever like bit they're committed to. Like even with Palin also has like Pontius Pilate, which in theory, that's one of many jokes that could in theory be like very dated, where it's like, oh, he's got a lisp, that's the whole joke. But it's his pomposity in performing every single bit when he's saying stuff like "biggest dickus" or "the side of Wome" and stuff like that. He's just so fucking like sure of himself that it makes the like mispronunciations just naturally funny. Because this dude is like has a huge stick up his ass.
I also feel like there's a real like, obviously like there's such a juvenile quality to a lot of this comedy. To go back to that stoning, because I think it's really funny. Like it's just like so like even as a kid, it's just incredibly funny to watch someone get like pelted with a bunch of rocks, you know. And even just that Pontius Pilate scene is like, it's so juvenile because like it's just him saying biggest dick like over and over again, and it's so childlike and it's so like stupid and like, and yet when he's like the way he's walking around and looking at all of like the Centurion guards and like going up to them and like it's so great. And his like, it is like the timing as well, like when the way that he kind of like says like, and he had a wife and the way he reveals that is like, it's so perfectly timed that even if you know what's coming, if you know that it's like stupid or whatever, it's still really, really funny and it still like really gets to you. And like I think that's what makes like a lot of this movie work.
It's my favorite kind of dumb juvenile humor, which is dumb juvenile humor written by clearly intelligent people. Because like it's the same principle that I think influenced stuff like The Simpsons or Futurama, stuff like that, where like those guys also had like, you know, they had like Harvard degrees, some of them, and were like incredibly smart people, but they just know how to write the smartest dumb joke possible. And in the case of like Monty Python, there's stuff like the Latin thing, where like Graham Chapman's trying to write on the walls in Latin, and John Cleese comes over and starts like berating him like a teacher would about just like, now conjugate the verb, do this, and
Listen, I almost pissed myself. It was the crazy. I had forgotten that joke 1000%, and it's also not. It's also just like the whole way of you're kind of just like, I know you know this. Why are you acting like you don't know this? Do it right. What is wrong with you? Like that vibe of it, where suddenly it's like, okay, now these are just two guys. It's so funny. It's so stupid. But again, it's also so stupid because it's like, yeah, you know what? I'm sure we don't think a lot about like, are you properly, like if it's your second language and you have to write graffiti in the second language, like how do you get there as far as like a joke? That's the thing that really like makes me laugh. It's not just like he's being stupid and being like, oh, hey, like you got to put up those slogans over there. It's something much more stupid than that. It's just like, no, you got to do it right. If you're going to do anything, do it right. Like,
with how like stupid it is still like a joke about grammar. Where like
exactly,
you know, like it's like a joke about like Latin grammar, which is like you were saying, Thomas, about like Simpsons writers being like really, really like smart and educated people. Like there is something like really like educated about like correcting someone on Latin, and yet it is like for this graffiti. And then like the part that like destroys me is when like it cuts to the morning. And then the guy's like, and then don't do it again. Just walks away.
Or even the line before that when he leaves, just like, now have it done by sunrise, I'll cut your balls off, and then leaves.
Honestly, this whole thing could just be like reciting bits, and I'd be here content all night. Because the thing is, it's just that I think I'm trying to think like, what do I find personally funnier, the stoning bit or the grammar bit? It's honestly just also that Graham Chapman's performance as Bryan is so friggin' funny. Because this whole time he's just so upset and so frazzled and everything is so stressful. And I have this thing when it's like characters that are just like going through it and they just can't ever get like over it. When he's being followed around and he's got the guy like yelling at him because of his vow of silence and his juniper berries and everything is so much and he's like losing his mind. It's a really good performance because he's not just yelling, he's trying really hard to like impress upon these people that like nothing that they say is what they think is going on, and it's not working, and he's just so overwhelmed. And it's a really, really funny performance. When you think about his character in a nutshell, he doesn't do much, right? He's just kind of there at the right place. Like, you know, he's just like being carted around and like all these things. Like it doesn't disappear behind, because he's not doing like a big voice. He doesn't really have like a gimmick in the same way as like a Pontius Pilate would, or or the Stan and Loretta thing, but it is still really funny. As much as there could be a straight man in a Monty Python thing, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing where Graham Chapman often kind of gets underrated because he was tragically the first one to die.
Yeah.
He dies in like '89 from like like throat cancer that was affected by like his smoking and alcoholism. But I think this movie and Holy Grail really show that like he sort of was the perfect person to like try and lead a Monty Python movie just as like a lead character, because he has like the right mix of kind of like an empathy that you can like engage with him on, and some kind of like dignity to some degree in terms of like he's like the one who's the least like a sketch character in terms of like how he's able to like pull off certain bits like this. But also, I feel so bad for him as Bryan. He's just so put upon. He just represents the like put upon working man of, in this case, like this biblical era, like the times of Jesus. He just feels like the average man who's just going around like, yeah, Jesus is doing a sermon on the mount. He's talking about blessed are the cheesemakers, or the Greeks shall inherit the earth, or whatever. And he's just like sitting there on the side. It's like, all right, I mean, I gotta like, I don't know, I have to do my job where I hand out concessions at the Coliseum, and I have to do like all this other shit, and my mom's hounding me, and I'm just kind of like depressed and sad, and I hate Roman culture and how it just takes over everything. He feels naturally like somebody who you would want to follow. I think that's the main reason why I really love Meaning of Life, but that movie is much more of a sketch movie, and I think it's because they couldn't quite find a role for like Graham to be centrally like a part of, to lead through like the thematic angle of that movie, which is like the different stages of life. If they had found that, I think the movie would be a lot stronger as a narrative. And I think it's a real testament to him being able to like kind of help string this together. And even though he doesn't get to play as many characters, but he makes it count. Like, of course, he plays Biggest Dickus, and wonderfully, when he does show up later on.
What an amazing bit. Like, to bury that so early in the movie, only to bring him back around and just to be like, yeah, and he's here, and he also has a stupid, silly voice. And his name is Biggest Dickus, and you're gonna laugh at it because you're all monkeys and you're here to laugh. Like, it's honestly just the thing about things like Monty Python and Mel Brooks and Simpsons even, where it's like, I personally, as somebody who I don't know if I even want to say this. Like, I've had people tell me, like, oh my God, you're very funny. I think being funny is so hard. And I think part of it is because it requires a lot of confidence without being arrogant. You got to believe what you're selling. You got to believe that what you're doing and what you're saying is funny. And I think the thing with all of these, like those formative things, the Monty Pythons and the Mel Brookses and stuff, is that like they are so confident that you're gonna at least crack a smile. Like, yes, it's stupid, but come on, the guy's name is Biggest Dickus. Are you gonna sit here and not laugh? And they'll just kind of keep like doing the like I'm not touching you thing, where like you're laughing, you think you're not, but you're laughing. And I think that's very fun.
Jael, I think you're funny. Very
well.
Funny. I wouldn't have you on if I didn't think you were naturally funny.
I mean, but that's the thing. It's like there's a difference between being stupid funny and being like intelligently funny. Like, I'm sorry, and I know it's like an easy joke to make because I used to, read my Bible with my family when I was 6 years old and say the same thing. When you're standing on the mountains at the Sermon of the Mount, how do you hear what the guy's saying when you're all the way back there? And that's like how they start. Well, no, because there's like the whole thing with like, oh no, I'll tell you the first moment where I almost pissed myself laughing. It was when the astrologers leave, when the three wise men leave, and they're walking towards the nativity scene in the hall, in like the alleyway, and they just have two halos on their heads, and that's just the moment where I was like, oh, okay, I'm in good hands here.
I mean, there is a real strict like commitment to the bit, which is a thing in like comedy I just like love, where it's like if you can do a bit and just like really like keep it going and keep doing it. I mean, like it's why Walk Hard is one of my favorite movies of all time, because like there are so many bits in that movie that they just like redo over and over and over and over again and really like commit to it, right? Like obviously like the wrong kid died and stuff like that, and this has that too, which is like maybe my second favorite scene following the graffiti scene, is the haggling scene where where Brian's like running away and he like goes to buy a beard and he's like, the guy's like, you're not gonna haggle for this? Like, we're supposed to haggle, this is the thing. And they just spend so much time
right when you think it's done, the gourd.
The gourd.
And it's like, how do we even get there? Because again, a lot of this is like the jokes about being far away from Jesus and not being able to hear him. The jokes about like, oh, Jewish people love to haggle or like whatever. Like they're not inventing these things whole cloth. But it's having the guts to like take it. It's just like be like, no, we're gonna sit with this. And we're gonna take it there for another 5 minutes and you're gonna laugh. At some point we're gonna hold you hostage and you're gonna laugh.
Obviously, like, what this movie as a whole is satire about Christianity and about like religion and stuff like that. And I like those bits where it is kind of like earnestly doing like satire about like, well, yeah, you wouldn't be able to hear him from far away, or like, I forget which one of them it is, the one who's standing going like, crucifixion, good, like that thing where it's like, yeah, what, how were the people lined up to be crucified, and just making a joke out of that. Or like they're all carrying the crosses and some guy like helps out, but he gets like he gets crucified instead.
It's not my cross. It's not my cross. And it's like, I get it. Get it.
I'm holding it for someone else.
Do you think he'll come back? It's also, this is really great as he's being like hoisted up.
It's also I feel very seen with that guy who's like stuck in the dungeon and he's like, oh, you lucky bastard, you're getting
Yes.
crucified. Like all of these things. And it's just like, I also love that this movie got it like 50 years ahead of Twitter discussing like leftist infighting. All of the bits about all of the different Jewish like rebel groups not being able to get along is so inspired in a way where like, yeah, oh, how'd you know? How'd you know that we'd be here on X discussing whether or not like
The whole bit about like the People's Front of Judea versus the Judean People's Front. It's like, fuck off! How dare you associate us with that?
Also,
that's stuff
when Bryan's like, no, we have to gather against the common enemy. I'm like, yeah, the PDF or whatever, and like he's like, no, the Romans, and like, oh yeah, we forgot it.
Right.
But like that scene towards the end where like the I forget who it is that comes in and is like, they're gonna crucify Bryan, we need to like go right now, and they're like, yeah, we'll get to it. All right, let's have a discussion about this, calm and collected.
Yep.
We'll have a vote, a referendum.
Let's make a motion to have immediate action.
That is both like incredibly funny and just like so great as a bit, and how that resolves where like we cut back to them like 5 minutes later, but also like, man, isn't that what politics just is in America right now? Like, you know, it's so great. And yeah, it's like, it feels incredibly like forward thinking, in that, in a way that we've been talking about, of like the way that a lot of comedy now is influenced by Monty Python, but also the way that like this movie kind of, you know, is talking about a lot of things that are still very, you know, relevant and stuff, and making jokes out of that, which is great.
Which I think is interesting because, like, the process of like writing this movie was fascinating. Where they originally, like, the way this movie even came about was while they were like promoting Holy Grail. Everyone kept asking like, "What's your next movie? What's your next movie?" And Eric Idle jokingly said, "Jesus Christ, Lust for Glory," which, I mean, admittedly, very funny bit if you're gonna be asked that. But then they kind of were like brainstorming that like maybe we could do a satire of Jesus, and they tried to write sort of around that idea of like, oh, Jesus would be like the main character of satire, and they just kind of realized like while they were doing it that there's not a lot to mock about this guy. Seems kind of like a boring dude who said a lot of good things. There's not much we can make fun of in that particular angle of it. So the decision to go over to organized religion or the politics angle of it, or any of these other things, is so ingenious because it's so great that we have Jesus as like this side character who, like, as Kyle mentioned, we see him in the manger, and then later on the Sermon on the Mount, all the way back in trivia, he's played by the guy, Kenneth Colley, who played Admiral Piet in the Star Wars movies.
Oh
the
my
guy
God.
who like rises the ranks of like Darth Vader's like empire in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. That's apparently him. But I like that idea that it's like, oh, Bryan is completely separate from Jesus. They're not the same character. He was just off to the side while like Jesus isn't getting any kind of glory. Bryan's like your average schlub who isn't the son of God, but ends up accidentally becoming like a religious figure through literal, just like he fell at the wrong place at the wrong time. And factions started rising about like that whole bit of like, oh, one side supports like the shoe because he left behind a sandal, and the other one is like the gourd sect of the Bryan religion who follows the gourd, is like such a brilliant, incisive satire of just like that infighting within even just religion. of that angle, which I'm curious, especially because Jael, I know you are a person of faith. I'm curious how you feel about the religious satire in general.
I am. I will say, they're better than me because the idea, in the notes, that whole thing, the skit of like, oh, his Jesus's cross keeps falling apart, and
Right.
and because he's the carpenter and he's perfect, he's gonna tell him how to do it correctly. That's hysterical, and I want it on my desk immediately. But, like, they're better than me because if I had been there, if I had been in the room, that thing is not that's not going on the cutting room floor. That's happening. But yeah, like I am a person of faith, but I also recognize that like I don't care what other people do, and if it makes me laugh, have fun with it. And I think with this movie, the funniest part about it is that yeah, like the whole thing of like there's all these different like prophets, and they're all kind of saying these crazy things just to try to get attention, and all the infighting and all of the like, particularly when they get to Pontius Pilate's palace and there's that other group there, and they're like, "No, we came up with this idea first," and then it's like then they're just like all fighting amongst each other. I think all that stuff is hysterical because it's like, yeah, like ideally, if you're all into this, we should all be working together, but they never do, and we all know the history of the world and how that stuff works. Seth MacFarlane has this problem, right, where he is clearly an atheist, or not even Seth MacFarlane, Ricky Gervais, right? Comedians who think that they are inherently better than people because they don't believe in God, right? And it's that really frustrating thing where it's like, okay, but be funny about it then. The joke can't just be, ha ha, they believe in God and I don't. Like, what does that do and how does that affect them? And I think part of why this movie is funny is it because it takes like, why do they have these certain traditions or these ways of thinking, or why do they insist on talking things out? Like, if you know anything about Judaism, you know that like it's a religion that like prioritizes a lot of like, asking questions and debating and talking. That's like, things that you know about like how they carry on their traditions, but like take that to the next absurdist extent, right? And I think that's funny. And again, I'm going to sit here and say that low hanging fruit, the joke that you can't hear Jesus from a couple miles away is really funny because I'm always thinking about that. And I'm always wondering, like, I don't know, did God help him project? Were the birds carrying his sound waves? It's funny. And I'd be the first to say like, oh, I think this kind of made me a little uncomfortable or whatever. I had a great time. I have always thought it's funny. I think if you're smart, it's what we keep saying. If you're smart about how you structure these jokes and what it is you want to make fun of, anything can be funny. You can make fun of virtually anything. Not to be one of these like people that gives them a pass to like, oh, see, like I can make fun of trans people and don't have to be woke about it. Like that's not what I'm trying to say. Because there is stuff here that hasn't aged the best. But
Right. Yeah.
comedy, it's something that Lindsay Ellis said a couple years ago that I always like. I love that she said it. Like, comedy is the quickest to age and the quickest to age poorly. But when you're inherently smart and you're thinking of things beyond just like what's going to get a reaction out of people, you can make good stuff that stands the test of time. And this is just one example of it.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you like so much of the satire of even like that the Sermon on the Mount thing is about people misinterpreting Jesus' teachings,
Exactly.
which I think is like so much more fun. Like another guy who's not part of the Monty Python people, but I just love him, Terrence Baylor, because of his eyebrows. That motherfucker with the biggest eyebrows possible, who's like part of like the very erudite couple who are just talking about like blessed are the cheesemakers. Well, he's not talking about specifically cheesemakers. It's more of a metaphor for general producers of dairy, and like he has this highfalutin idea of a total misinterpretation of what the dude said.
And all of that stuff is like, it could easily go so left so quickly as far as like the stereotypes or all of these things. But no, like it's that. The whole like misinterpreting his, or like when somebody's trying to repeat Jesus's words and it's not working because he's not Jesus. He doesn't have that zing, right? Like that whole scene where Bryan's trying to get away from the soldiers and he's trying to like hide amongst all of the different prophets, and he's trying to like kind of repeat what he heard on the Sermon on the Mount. And he's like, well, the birds, they're important, kind of, but you're more important. So what does that tell you? And it's like, it's not working because you don't have it, guy. Like you're not Jesus. And that's what I think is also really fun, is that like this undercurrent of like, you got to either have it or you don't. And Bryan just doesn't have it. And it's just like that funny, like show. It's very The Substance. It's very like, sometimes people have it. Sometimes people just don't have it. Maybe she's born with it.
That was really weird when Eric Idle came out of Graham Chapman's back for 7 days. That was a really interesting choice. But Brian, I know you were raised religious. How do you feel about that religious satire?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with like what Jael said. Like, I think they make really smart, funny observations about like religion and like, you know, just, and I do view it as like it isn't like just making fun of like religion because people believe in something. It is making fun of like organized religion and like what that does to people and how that can kind of like, I think of the scene where he's like talking to them outside the window like of his house. And he's like, you have to find it out for yourselves. And then they're like, yes, we agree. We're following you. Like, it's
You're all individuals. Yes, we're all individuals.
right. Like, that is, I think, such a, like, more of a, like, satire of Christianity than anything that, right, like, that, like, Seth MacFarlane has done or anything. Or, like, you know, yeah, or I think, or the scene... it's around the guy who's taken up the vow of silence. Like, I love just the bit where they basically do the bit from Dune, where Bryan's saying like, I'm not the Messiah, please, like I'm not, and he's like, oh, of course, his divine presence. He's so humble that he must be the Messiah. Like, that stuff is so.
I had to pause. And like lie back, and I had to have a serious think with myself about like, how intentional is that comedic beat in Dune Part 2 when it cuts and it's this guy and it's Stilgar talking. He's like, the Mahdi is too humble. All the more reason to listen. Like, how intentional. I have questions that need answers because now I'm like, that can't possibly have been incidental. There has to be something there.
I did love that bit in Dune 2 where Timothy Chalamet said like, I'm not the Kwisatz Haderach, now fuck off. And Javier was just like, now how shall we fuck off?
It's so stupid, but it's that, and it's like, okay, Dune is playing it very serious and talking about like, is this where we have our galaxy brain take that really Life of Brian and Dune Part 2 are like a secret, like we got to get them programmed at the same time at like the TIFF Lightbox Theater or whatever. Like,
both very sandy movies. Both
have both have nude people in sand.
But
now I want to program that. Timmy would show up to that, I think. Timmy kind of just
a
shows
double
up
feature
places.
of Dune? I assume Part 2 is with Part 1, right? No.
It's Part 2 into the Life of Brian. No, it's a sneak peek of Messiah. No, you wish.
another like bit we've kind of mentioned it a little bit is like the guy in the jail who's like hanging up, who is like also just a great like kind of representation of like Roman propaganda, because he is like, oh yeah, the Romans, they gave like they're so kind to me or whatever, and like I think it's when like Bryan leaves and he's like, terrific race, the Romans. Which is also just made me laugh so hard. And just his line where he says like, oh, it must be the Jailie's pet, huh? It's because he like gets spit on.
Well, especially, Terry Gilliam is like the least talented performer of any of these guys, but he's so good at playing like weird monster guys like the jailer guy, or the one like false prophet who's like covered in mud and shit like that. Like that's like where he excels. And that whole bit where they're talking about like where he's talking to Bryan and the other guy's just like, oh, Romans being all pissed, and he's just like, what was that? Nothing. I'm sorry, bye. So like, it's so good. I think it's also a real testament to something else with this movie. It looks so fucking good. Like, admittingly, the transfer I got is, like, once again, of this DVD that was transferred from the Laserdisc. It's not a great transfer, but the fact that they actually shot this in Tunisia and are using, like, actual, like, amazing locations like this, and it's so elaborate and big. A big thing with, like, Holy Grail is that was co-directed by Terry Jones and Terry Gilliam, and the Pythons hated that relationship because Gilliam was so much more focused on, like, the look of everything, that they were just like, oh, hey, we're shooting, like, a comedy. You can stop making this look like a Pasolini movie, Gilliam. We can, like, move on from this so we could do our, like, comedy bits. And the decision for Life of Brian was that Jones would be the director and actually deal with, you know, like, one-on-one with, like, the cast and everything, and also get some of, like, the bigger shots, like, in a way that felt, like, appropriate for the comedy, versus Gilliam is the, like, production designer of this movie, and I think that is, like, exactly where it should be. because like I like some of Terry Gilliam's movies, but he's much more of like a visual artist than he ever is, particularly as like a actor's director. If you ever heard stories and shit like that. And with this movie, it looks immaculate. The production design's amazing. The use of like these actual locations, it looks so goddamn good that it makes it so great when they do dumb bits in the middle of like actual Tunisian locations, and like it looks like an actual like Hollywood epic from like a historical epic from like the 50s or whatever, but with like dumb comedy bits in the middle of it.
That first shot where the three wise men are walking across the dunes and the sun is setting on like the left of the frame and everything's like orange and purple and you see the shadow of like the three camels walking into Bethlehem. That's crazy. I thought I was going crazy because I was like, oh, this looks like really good. Like, and I thought, I was like, am I being that guy? Like, you know how people on Twitter will, like, they'll praise Fantastic Four from 2005 just because, like, they actually went on, like, a bridge and they filmed on there. I didn't want to be that guy. But I did have a moment where I was like, okay, I'm not just on one. Like, this looks really nice. We yearn for sets.
It's the great, yeah, I mean, like, yeah, not to be a person, like, praising Fantastic Four or anything, like, yeah, but the use of like these physical sets and like the costume design, which like the Roman armor like looks good. It doesn't look like cheap, like, thrown together or anything. But then like they use like a lot of like cheap props as jokes. Like the beards look so fake and so stupid. Like you got them at like the Dollar Tree. And yet it works for the joke. Like it makes it even funnier that there's like so obviously fake beards. And it makes it way funnier. And the fact that they're using like just so many real sets and there is like a real physicality, like I think of like when Bryan's running from like the guards and you just see him like physically run from like location to location or up the tower or whatever, and it just like it really works. And like I will say, like I agree with you, Thomas, like I mean like the Pontius Pilate, like his like chamber or whatever where he's first like introduced, like it looks gorgeous, and there is these like wide shots of it where it looks like fucking like the Ten Commandments or something. It like looks really, really incredible, like way better than you would expect for something like this. That like like I always think of like Monty Python using like the coconuts as like the horses thing, where that's such a like cheap kind of like thing to do, and yet it adds to the humor, and yet they have these like really amazing sets. It's like it's a great balance of like knowing where to put your production design and like your production value, and how you can kind of like use low production design to like create more jokes,
Or of course, I'm sure, Bryan, you were referencing earlier the weird random thing that you were shocked happened you weren't aware of. Speaking of him climbing up the tower and then falling off, and then were you talking about the space aliens, Bryan?
Yeah. Oh my god,
dude, what? I completely blacked that out. I had completely forgotten. Completely, I was sitting there and I'm like, wait, did I switch? Am I watching Spaceballs? What happened? Like, I got so confused. I fully thought, like, because full disclosure, cards on the table, I perhaps may not have watched this in the most legal way possible. I fully thought something had happened to, like, the link. I was like, did this get, like, swapped? Like, what happened? It was very funny. And I like that they have, like, weird little, like, it's that thing where it's like design for design's sake. They have, like, weird little, like, colostomy bags. They have these weird bags of fluid that are just hanging from the ceiling. And I love that because I'm like, sure. Okay.
Well, and I think that's where you really get a bit of like you can tell that Terry Gilliam was more on the like behind the camera kind of production design stuff, where like that interior of like the ship looks great. It looks really great for like this small joke that you're doing, but it looks way better than it needs to be for this stupid bit. And like the alien, like I don't know if they're animatronics necessarily, like the puppet, I guess, like that eyeball and things like look really, really cool, even though they're just going to be used for this stupid like throwaway bit.
And even like the models and stuff, it looks like an actual Star Wars bit just in the middle of this fucking movie.
I fully was like, okay, so what, did Lucas have some designs lying around he just never got to use, and they were just kind of like, thank you. Like, it's also just, this thing has a good sense of scale. Like, I think about the joke with the graffiti, and like when it cuts to day and you see like
Oh,
the
yeah.
building with all of that writing on it, and you're kind of just like, damn, like they really did build this stuff. Like whether it was like the set or just a model or whatever. The scene where Pontius Pilate and Biggest Dickus are like getting made fun of like by the crowds because they keep talking and
Yes.
sounding stupid. And there's like a hell of a lot of people out there.
Yeah.
You know, just things like that where I'm like, good Lord. In Tunisia.
Especially that you're getting all those extras to do stuff. Like there's the bit after like they're initially like Biggest Dickus and Pontius Pilate are talking to that big crowd, and they're starting to like make fun of him, and they cut to like some other shit, and they cut back, and every single one of those extras is there like on their back with their feet in the air, like howling with laughter. That's like such a massive scale for, once again, the dumb thing of like they're making him say like funny dirty things.
Yeah, they're making him say like, "Oh, rapist," and it's like, okay, thanks for that. But yet you have like hordes of people in like this random, and also thinking about like the beginning, like the legitimately pretty stunning shots of like all of the people walking in the desert to get to the Sermon on the Mount, where they make the joke that it's like tea time in like Judea in the year 33, and it's like, yeah, just like, okay, work with your Ten Commandments teas, like I like it.
Yeah, I mean, and also the we haven't talked about it too much, but like the opening credits thing, which I guess is supposed to be, is it supposed to be like a James Bond like spoof? Because that's what I thought when I was
It
watching.
kind of, yeah, the
but-
song in particular feels like
yeah.
a parody of like a James Bond song.
And I
you know?
just, I think it's a great thing where it's just like he has arms and legs and hands. This really gets me, but I love that like art style, and I don't know if it has a name or anything, but just that kind of like the kind of cutout, but mixed with like medieval like artwork. Like it reminds me a lot of I keep referencing video games this season here, but there's this video game called Pentiment that came out last year that is like has a very similar like art style to this, where it's like medieval like paintings, and I don't know, like I can't really describe it, but I just, something about that, like that specific art style I like always really loved, specifically how Monty Python does it, like this opening credits where like the way that like I think of the shot of like this pillar, and like one of the pieces at the bottom falls out, and then like it just like bronk, like just falls down. It's I don't know, it's so like appealing to me. I don't know why necessarily, but yeah, I've just always really been like into that art style that Monty Python has.
And that's all Gilliam stuff, which he's definitely like, this is the one with the least amount of animation of like the major like Python stuff. It's pretty much that opening sequence, and there's a bit of it I think during like the space alien thing, which was the one section Gilliam kind of directed of this, maybe because it had the least amount of cast members involved who didn't want to, like, Graham could deal with it, I guess, for one sequence. But yeah, it is interesting how like that style is so like key to Monty Python. I think this movie doesn't have as much of that, but at the same time, I think that opening sequence gives you a lot of that like anarchy that's there, and also I think explains a lot. There was a whole thing too when they made Holy Grail where like the cast members is like Gilliam was literally placing them in certain places where it's like, we're not cutouts, we're fucking people, Terry. Like that, we can't just be fucking manipulated like that, man. You're not in your fucking little studio animating shit. As opposed to like Jones, who I think is underrated in terms of like as a director, because he directed Meaning of Life and also a couple other things. I did recently watch like Eric the Viking, which is like an 80s movie, and then he did a live action version of Mr. Toad's that has most of the Monty Python people in it. The thing that with all of his movies is that like you can tell that he has like an actual warmth and respect for like character, but at the same time he knows how to make like the scale elements of it really work for like whatever the story is, in this case the comedic bits are supposed to be. Like even stuff like when during the climax where you have like the crosses up, there was a whole thing where they were originally gonna have like people with like, you know, the spiked hands, and during production he just kind of was like, that's gonna ruin the joke if like they have like actual like spikes through the hands. It's not gonna be nearly as funny if we just like tie them up. That's like a directorial choice that actually works for the actual comedy, as opposed to, I'm sure Gilliam would have gone full passion if he had directed that bit.
Exactly. Like I was gonna say, it's a time where like less is more, where it is just more absurd to kind of have them tied up and like kind of easily be able to get out of it, and yet they're all just kind of stuck there. Because the physical, I mean, it's why T-posing became a thing for the youths, right? It's why like it's funny. It's just a funny way to look. It's just weird. But I think, yeah, there's a lot of stuff where it's like the exercise in restraint of like even the stuff with like biggest tickets at the end of it, like the stuff with their voices, it's like they're not there for 15 minutes, you know? It's just like a little something sweet for the kids to laugh at, you know?
Yeah,
Like
well, it's that, and then like they'll have a little bit, cut to something else, have like another bit go on, and then like cut back to it, and the cut back to like biggest dickus and Pontius Pilate is so funny because you're like, oh, this is still going on. Like that's still that. It makes it funnier to sort of like let go of something, cut away from it, and then cut back to it much later, and like a lot of it is where like a lot of the jokes like in this come from, especially like I think of later on when the like Centurion guard like goes to, it's Terry Gilliam and already forgot who it was who's doing the like crucifixion, good like those
Palin, yeah.
yeah, like those two, and then like just having them return is such a funny image, and then you get like the really great button at the end where they're like, all right, yeah, so tell me about that story. He's like, oh yeah,
Oh right, yeah,
I
because
told her,
it's
you
Eric
know,
Idle
it
and
was-
Terry Gilliam who are both like they're both kind of like speaking monosyllabically, or
Yes.
Eric Idle has a bit of a stutter, and like that joke, I think it's one of those things that like could once again in theory like not age as well, but the fact that they do go back and they just have like a very quiet discussion, but like, so yeah, I like the guy and I really wanted to like hang out with him, but I don't know, like that they just drop the facade there. I
and
think
then like
that's
the cutaway
Yeah.
is so funny, like away from that scene where like it's as you're like laughing like so hard, it cuts away from it, which is great. But sorry, continue.
No, I think that's what's interesting too, is that like there's even certain gags where like probably the biggest thing that doesn't age well about this movie is the one Eric Idle character Loretta, where there's a whole joke about how Loretta, you know, is wants to identify as female, and there's a transphobic sort of joke, shockingly delivered by John Cleese. How interesting.
Oh, he doesn't say any controversial stuff.
No, never. He's never.
No one
said
in this
anything
cast
bad.
does actually. What?
No, no one, not him or Gilliam specifically. No, never. But no, like that whole bit definitely does not age necessarily that well. But I think it ages badly in a fascinating way, where like the whole crux of that is basically like Cleese is the one guy who questions Loretta wanting to transition in this way, and then throughout the movie ends up using not her dead name and actually like uses her real name throughout this whole thing. It's so fascinating how like that bit has aged so oddly that like it's gone a complete 180 in terms
It's
of like
so
no,
strange.
yeah, right.
No, sorry, I caught that. I caught that just because at the end when they're doing their whole joke about like they're taking the minutes and they're talking about how they need to draft a statement because Brian's going to get crucified or whatever the joke is, and they have Loretta taking the minutes, and then Judith comes in and she's upset because they're not doing anything about Brian getting crucified. And when she leaves, they make some joke about like something about feminists, like something demeaning about feminists. And Loretta reacts and they go, "Oh, sorry, love, sorry, Loretta, whatever. Read us the minutes, why don't you?" Like some weird Mad Men like secretary joke. You know what I'm saying? Where I was just kind of like, what are we doing here? What axis of transphobia are we operating on? I'm a little confused. Just so odd. Just so strange.
Right. It's just the weird thing where like their commitment to the bit ends up making like that thing that in 79 was like satirical ends up actually becoming like the way that like, no, this is actually like empathetic in the way that we should treat people. That's just so fascinating to me. And keep in mind, cis people talking about this, you know, be judged for yourselves. But I do just find that fascinating that like the joke is aged in such a way that it's like, no, it's not a joke anymore. That's just like treating somebody with empathy. That's not funny, John, specifically. I'll just specifically point at John. It's not fucking funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the only other aged poorly like thing I can point to is like one of them does blackface at the beginning of
Oh,
when they're the
brother.
Three Wise Men, where I was like, oh, and it really is that and the kind of like the Loretta bit, which are kind of early on. It's very weird to watch this movie for the first time in 2024 and go like, oh no, is this about to be like kind of a disaster? And then like again with that scene that we just talked about, like exception, like there's not a lot of other stuff that is like I hate using this word because it has just no meaning anymore, but like offensive in like 2024. There's a lot of stuff that is like pushing boundaries, which I think is like, again, despite what we like the current reputations of John Cleese and Terry Gilliam and whatnot, like that is like kind of skirting the line but still really funny, I think. that is one of those things that like, yeah, it just kind of like is just outright weird and like, oh, I don't know.
Yeah. It ages weirdly, but I think in a way that, like, I don't know, we can embrace the fact that, like, not every, like, a comedy can have jokes that don't age that well. It's like Jael was saying earlier, that, like, the Lindsay Ellis thing of just, like, comedy inherently can age very poorly. And there's some of those jokes where it's almost just, like, I don't even know why we need, like, there's one other joke I can think of, which is, like, early on, Bryan's mother, Mandy, talks about, like, being raped by a centurion, by a Roman. And she goes into like a whole thing like, he promised me the world, going to like extravagant places.
No, it's an even weirder joke because it's like her son obviously is like, oh my God, like he was a Roman, you were a Jewish woman, so you were raped. And she goes, I want to say she says something like at first, or it started out that was something like that, where I was just like, okay, like, but I will say the bar is in hell, but the fact that we can only pinpoint like 2 or 3 of these is a little like, given how things can be, right? Like, I was surprised that the Pontius Pilate biggest dickest stuff didn't get into more like the weird gay joke territory.
Right.
I as like, as I'm watching now as an adult for the first time in like a while, I was a little surprised. I was like, look at that restraint. How rare.
Yeah, or even that, like, I mean, the whole joke of like all the women wearing beards or like pretending to be men is like, again, it's weird that that's not the most like kind of weirdly transphobic thing in this movie. It actually kind of works because of how ridiculous and how like funny it is that every single woman is putting, like, I love that they all start out going like, it was him, no, it was they'd lower their voices because they forget. Like, this entire time while I'm watching this movie, I couldn't help but keep thinking of Martin Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ, which is a similar kind of religious story that had a lot of controversy with religion, has Pontius Pilate in it, which I think is funny that it's David Bowie in that movie.
I mean, David Bowie and Michael Palin, very similar.
Right, exactly.
Clearly.
Two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, and I thought of it as well with like the finale of this movie, but the kind of crucifixion of that movie, which is just like, Scorsese is a Catholic. He's like he's taking it so earnestly and so like deeply, like, and this movie, like, which again I wasn't expecting, ends with a fucking musical bit, which is just so great and so funny, and really works from like a visual perspective where you see like just those final shots of like of how the camera like zooms out and you get like all of the crosses in it in the shot is so like weirdly beautiful and funny, and like it looks really great, and it's also just such a ridiculous, silly, dumb way to end the movie, which I love. I think it's great.
Yeah, and that song is also very important. Always Look on the Bright Side of Life, which Eric Idle wrote for this movie. He was sort of like the songwriter of the group in particular. Anytime there's like a musical bit in the Monty Python thing, Eric Idle most likely wrote it. And it's like so indelible. It's one of the key things of Python in general is that song, which is like had a whole life of its own where like it ended up becoming like an unofficial anthem for like English football. If your team loses, you sing Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. And it's like, and it became like a #1 single that Eric Idle added like a whole verse about like when you're in the World Cup and all your hopes are up, like that kind of thing. And it ended up becoming like having that kind of life. And also he's just jammed it into any fucking project he can. Like it's in Spam-A-Lot, the Holy Grail musical. It's integrated into there. And even like he did a sort of operetta of Life of Bryan. He adapted into that and had to put it in there. It's like everywhere. Anytime that like any kind of Monty Python thing has happened, it usually ends up ending with like Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. And I get it because like it's kind of the perfect Monty Python comedy song in that it's so like a cheery, heartfelt kind of like number about just like, well, life's shit, but you know what, you gotta like purse your lips and whistle, even though once again you're on the crosses, you're about to die slowly and horribly. But you gotta think about the bright side of it. It's like ingenious.
It's funny. H. Bomber Guy, he made this joke once in his like video essay about Sherlock Holmes, where he was talking about how like, oh, like Americans have Brits beat as far as like indelible worldwide pop culture. Like there's not like, he was trying to make the point that like Sherlock is one of the few things that's like very uniquely British and yet very universal in its appeal. And I think regardless of how much you could argue that Monty Python is like ubiquitous the world over, I think Always Look on the Bright Side of Life is so perfectly British and yet so popular because like, you know, like I had heard that song in all sorts of contexts before I even fully knew that it was from Life of Brian, that it was even Monty Python. Like you said, Thomas, it's a football thing. I've heard it referenced in like other things on YouTube and TV shows, like whatever. And it's also kind of cute that it comes from a movie that's like tangentially about Jesus, because that is something that Jesus like kind of says, you know, like, oh, focus on the day. Each day has its own stuff. Don't even worry about it. Like, it is funny that for a bunch of guys that were like, yeah, I mean, we're not all really particularly religious, but whatever. They do kind of bring out this sort of secular hymn, as it were, to kind of like focus on the good, even if it is supposed to be like facetious and then biting and witty. But I think it's cute that like Britain likes to pull that out. Like when you look up the song on Wikipedia, it'll give you like all of the little things of like how they've changed the lyrics for different events, like at the Olympics and things like that. Like I like that. It's cute.
Yeah, it's a song that Eric Idle can respectfully dine on like the rest of his life.
Hell
Like,
yeah.
dude. That song's like so good. Do it.
I do want to ask you guys a question, just because. So this whole thing is talking about the Criterion Collection, and I don't know if I'm stealing host duties, Thomas. I don't know if I'm overstepping here, but I do just want to kind of ask
Look,
you
you're
guys.
out of practice. You want to go into it? Go ahead. It's fine.
Oh no, it's just that like I this whole time, you know, we're talking about like the stonings and women wearing beards and all these things, and I'm kind of like, so where does that fit in? Because the Criterion Collection, we've talked about it. We talked about it at the beginning. It has this sort of reputation of like, you know, it's heady and it's academic, and these are meant to be like capital I important films. So like, why does Life of Brian fit into there?
I get the idea of having a Monty Python movie in the Criterion Collection in theory, because like they're very culturally significant. There is a sort of like, you know, fascination with Monty Python as like a group, to where like they're culturally significant enough to where, especially like this is Spine 61. This is very early when Criterion's kind of like feeling themselves. It's not too far off from what was like the Armageddon and the Rock, you know, releases on DVD, which we could have also in theory done, and mainly talked about the Ben Affleck commentary for Armageddon with that.
Which you don't want to get me on a podcast where I could talk about Ben Affleck for 2.5 hours. You were very smart to not give me that option. That was you being the Lisan Al Gaib. You don't know what you avoided.
I am the Quetzal's Haderach of this podcast, that's true. But with that angle of it, I can see why they would be like, hey, let's put a Monty Python movie in the Criterion Collection. And of all of them, I think Life of Brian is the one that fits at least the closest, I think, because of like what we're talking about, the way that it kind of feels like a big grand epic, the way that it feels a bit more like a cohesive story compared to like Holy Grail. Holy Grail, I would raise my eyebrow a bit more. That would feel more kind of like and I don't really, we talked about this earlier this season, I don't really give a shit that like Wally's in the Criterion Collection, but that Holy Grail feels like it would be the like most obvious sort of like, oh, you're trying to get like more people to buy your DVD in this case version of this, because like nerds will fucking buy the Criterion DVD at that time of fucking Holy Grail, versus like Life of Brian feels like just the right choice, because like if you did Meaning of Life, that would also feel odd, because it's like this, I don't know how like culturally significant this movie necessarily is. At the same time, like I think like Life of Brian's like the exact sweet spot of like, if you're gonna have a silly comedy from the Monty Python group in the collection, I feel like the one that feels the most like a movie, quite frankly, is the one that they would probably gravitate toward.
I think it is that sort of like cultural significance thing where like it's like you said, Jael, like not many cultural things, whatever you want to call Monty Python and like Sherlock and stuff, like not many of those things like really resonate this deeply and go this deeply outside of like their native country. Gilliam has quite a few movies in their Criterion Collection, so I think that probably kind of like helps a little bit. And I think like I agree, like the Criterion Collection has this reputation as like very important, very serious. These are serious movies that we all like, you know, it's part of the Sight and Sound list and stuff like that. But I think they do a pretty decent job, I would say, at mixing in like not just kind of the super serious art house world cinema stuff, like you said, like Wall-E is in there. Like I think of a lot of the old like comedies that they have on there. I mean, we talked about like Playtime, which is kind of maybe more the fancy person's comedy, like physical comedy or whatever. Last year I went on like a huge binge where I watched a bunch of like those old like 30s screwball comedies.
Oh my
which
God.
obviously like they're very important for like they have huge movie stars like Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn, Jimmy Stewart, but like they're incredibly silly and ridiculous movies. And I think that, like, although they can skew more like serious and kind of important or whatever, they do have that kind of like lighter touch. Like, I always think of, like, on the Criterion channel, they do like the Saturday matinee kind of like recommendation thing, which I think is really cool, and they have a lot of like really cool sort of lighter fare on there. Because like, it's kind of a weird thing where, like, especially watching Life of Bryan, like, I would definitely recommend it to anyone who is into like films of any, you know, if you're into like indie film, art house films, like, you know, like we are, like, I would definitely recommend it. Like, it's not something I would turn my nose up at or anything like that. So I think, I don't know, it's definitely a thing that they kind of like, they definitely lean more in one direction, but they still have a kind of like a bit of a more populist sensibility in some cases, if that made sense.
All of what you guys are saying is absolutely, like, it makes a lot of sense. It's just that I found myself like looking through the comedy tag on the Criterion website, and it's just a little funny because compared to something like, I don't know, like Daisies, or what else is on here as technically a comedy, Worst Person in the World, you know, like things like that where I'm like, ha ha ha, funny.
It is like comedy, like, ha ha ha, isn't this is quite humorous, is it not?
It's rich man laugh comedy. It's
Right.
very like quaint. Like, I'm sorry, these people are on one. I'm so sorry. I need to have a conversation with who is creating these classifications, because calling Ito Mama También a comedy is crazy work. That is beyond. No, man.
Side splitter. I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh
just like
my
God. Knees hitting. Just
It's on TBS on Thursdays at 7 p.m. Just because, ha 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 ha.
each Mama Tombi, and we know comedy characters are local.
Dude, like, what? I don't even like, and I like this movie, Fantastic Mr. Fox. I bought that on Criterion for my sister for an anniversary. Frances Ha as a comedy is crazy. That's evil.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, I think, the way that, like, they have, while trying to represent, like, comedies or even, like, sci-fi films, where it is, like, you know, the sci-fi films they have are, like, Man on Wire, like, where it's, like, a Fassbender movie. It's like, okay, this is, or, like, Solaris, you know, where it's like, okay, yeah, we're representing, like, science fiction, but it is a bit more, like, yeah, like,
man, science fiction. I love using that voice. It's just fun.
like, they're not gonna have, like, I mean, this is the most, like, crude example, but, like, a Judd Apatow, like, box set or something, or like an Adam Sandler collection or something like that, you know, maybe
The
they
Wedding
should,
Singer
actually.
for the Criterion Collection.
I mean, wait, I'm not gonna fight that.
The Funny People 4K release.
I would buy that. Absolutely.
Not the funny people for that got me. Jesus Christ. All three of us that remember that funny people exist. Oh God.
I think honestly, like, the closest to more, like, when they do have some of these on here, it's been some of, like, the more recent comedy releases, like Pink Flamingos, I think is closer to, like, A Life of Bryan than some of these other comedies that we're
Fair.
talking about, where they're just willing to have, like, these movies that are anarchic and silly and deranged to some degree, though that has at least the, like, queer history angle of it with John Waters, as opposed to, like, once again, yeah, Life of Bryan is much more of, like, this very British kind of thing, but at the same time has, I think, just, like, the production value of it and a lot of those other things, I think, make it feel slightly more in common with the collection. But I agree with you. It's one of the few, like, zanier movies. There's few Criterion comedies I would call zany that would be on there.
Exactly. Ooh, Happiness. So funny.
Very zany, very wacky.
But do you see what I'm talking about? These are the things where I'm like, why do you do this to me? Because then you make it so hard to defend you. When you've got Happiness classified as a comedy.
Right. I guess I should also correct that, like, again, this is kind of what we're talking about, but, like, I mentioned Adam Sandler, like, Punch Drunk Love is in the Criterion Collection.
Like, God bless. Even though, like, is Punch Drunk Love
Right. It is kind of like that weird, like, it's still Paul Thomas Anderson, so it has a kind of, like, it has a reverence to it. It has some kind of, like, weight behind it, but it isn't, like, you know, right. Yeah. Or that, like, sorry, one I just thought of as a great example of this is, like, Election, where it's like, it is it's a very funny movie, but it still has a kind of, like, respectability among, like, the critics, the film lovers, like it doesn't, it
Yeah.
isn't considered like low art necessarily, which I think is kind of the what we're kind of talking about.
We're getting to that, which is to say that like when we talk about, and maybe it's because I'm in stupid awards punditry mode for embarrassing reasons, but I do just think about like how people talk about like, oh, when we get into the Oscars and things like that, they don't really they, if there's two genres of movies they don't particularly see it for, it's comedy and horror, right?
Right.
And all of the other comedies that we've been talking about are like the thinking men's comedies, right? Like versus something like Life of Brian, which is so not the thinking, even though like we've talked at length about like there are intelligent jokes, there are intelligent things to dig into. This is not like your college improv group like just on film. Like these guys, like they make it a point to be like talented with this stuff, but Life of Brian is so not that. So I just find that fascinating. I'm happy it's there. I wish there were
Yeah.
other things that were zanier and it wasn't such a one-off.
Maybe that's a question: is what's a zany movie you would want on the Criterion Collection? What's a zany comedy that you think would deserve that treatment?
I gotta pull out Letterboxd. See, I talk a lot of crap, but then Letterboxd is really helpful for things like this. So hang on a second.
I mean, my
let me
obvious one, while you're looking, I would just say Walk Hard. I mentioned it earlier, but like just
Hell
one of
yeah.
the funniest American films of all time.
Just for the way that Paul Rudd says "great liquid," or however he, it's amazing.
Have a very beautifully, tastefully done portrait of John C. Reilly on the
Yes.
cover, in Criterion style.
I mean, Hustlers is a comedy that I love that I think is really important in film as far as like a moment in time. I feel very strongly about Hustlers. I love Hustlers,
Great
and I think
movie.
I think it's a great movie, and I think I would love to see that in the Criterion Collection. Just because of that, like it's both for a moment in time for filmmaking and a moment in time for like the period piece that it operates as. Like, because it's so weird. I was not living in New York. I was not a sex worker in 2008 in New York. And yet that movie felt so specific and so good. Not that this is going to turn into the Hustlers podcast, but yeah, my vote's for Hustlers.
I feel like, there's certain Mel Brooks movies that I think could deservedly be in the Criterion Collection, like Young Frankenstein or Blazing Saddles. I think either could deserve
I also am there for both those two exactly were the ones that you just stole from my head because, oh my God.
Yeah, I think like the thing with both of those that you guys mentioned is like weirdly enough to compare Mel Brooks and the film Hustlers, but like they both have a kind of like I said earlier, like a kind of respectability among like critics. Like I feel like Hustlers especially has kind of gained a lot of traction, especially, I mean, Jennifer Lopez was robbed of a Best Supporting Actress nomination, I'll say it.
Mm-hmm.
And like I think yeah, like that is like Hustlers. I can definitely see them like as an example of like a newer movie, a newer comedy, a newer like a very contemporary movie that like would get put in the Criterion Collection. I can like definitely see that. And the same with Mel Brooks as like someone who is like incredibly important to like comedies in the same way that like Monty Python is.
So what you're saying is I need to be bold and say pop star Never Stop Never Stopping deserves to be in the
Okay.
Criterion.
Yeah,
Yes,
do it.
Absolutely.
If only for the Bin Laden song that almost ended up on my Spotify Wrapped one year. Like it came this close. God, what a good song. That's gonna get stuck in my head.
It is interesting. We should point out as well that in terms of like this comedy and Criterion angle, there is one comedy that's like very famous and very zany in its own right that had a Laserdisc release on Criterion and never transferred even over to DVD. Ghostbusters.
Oh,
They released that movie on Laserdisc.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Oh, you were holding that hot hand. You were excited. You said, wait, I'm about to goop the girls with this one. That's so crazy. What? So hold on, because now we got to get into. Damn it, Thomas. Now we got to get into the laser disc only. I'm going to start. Hold on. Give me some.
I feel like
That's a fascinating list as well. Yeah.
I feel like it is part of that thing of like of what we started talking about, where it was like it's just rights issues, and I feel like a lot of like with maybe like popular comedies that we're talking about, like studios or people kind of really hold on to those rights and either like obviously put them on streaming or put out their own like shitty Blu-ray that has like no special features or whatever. And I think like, again, this is just me kind of like guessing because I wasn't alive, but I get the sense that like when it was Laserdisc, it was maybe a bit easier, and physical media was certainly different, that it might have been kind of easier to get something like Ghostbusters, to get the release rights to something like Ghostbusters than it obviously is now, with
especially for such a niche format that like Laserdisc really was, because like Laserdisc was never like a massive thing compared to VHS, was like so dominant still even during that like major era of Laserdiscs.
I have found a Reddit graphic showing the things that were on listen. Boogie Nights, Seven, what else is on here? Halloween, Akira. There's a lot happening here. Boys in the Hood.
God, we used to be a country, man.
Monty Python and the Holy Grail was released on Laserdisc. I'm seeing that right now. We did used to be a country. Dr. No, Blade Runner.
Yeah, and I feel like now it's kind of
The
like
producers. The original
there you go.
producers.
Yeah.
Sorry. Jesus Christ.
I feel like now it is like, well, you can get like Warner Brothers has kind of like held on to like the Blade Runner rights, and now they have a 4K that you can buy, and they have a steelbook or whatever. I feel like it's very different now, it's very interesting, because just looking back at all that like huge list of Laserdiscs, it's very weird.
This is a tangential question I really have really
Yes.
fast. Do you guys think that there's some sort of form of media that we have right now, like currently, that it will be our version of Laserdisc? A thing that we just kind of like, wow, we had it and we lost it and we didn't know? Or is that just kind of like done?
I feel like 4K is like kind of the last example of that, in terms of like it's much more niche, to where like I buy 4K discs all the time, but that's definitely more of like a thing that like most people have stopped buying like much physical media in general, particularly like Blu-ray. It feels like the last one that would be somewhat ubiquitous, and even then it doesn't compare to like DVD or VHS if you like look at the actual like numbers of people who bought that shit. So I feel like 4K sadly is kind of that, where like nerds like us will definitely buy a 4K, but like the average person just like 4K.
Right.
I resent the implication that I'm a nerd. First of all, that came out of you. Wait, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, how dare you call me a nerd, Thomas, as I look at my 50th anniversary 4K of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre that I
as I'm cradling my Inside Llewyn Davis Criterion,
right.
the least relevant Coen Brothers release. Good lord.
Yeah, I feel like it will be 4K just because like Blu-rays are kind of everywhere in a way. Like you can get like even just regular Blu-rays like fairly cheaply, like under $10, and 4Ks are still kind of this new thing where like they're becoming a lot cheaper now as 4K TVs and stuff become more like universal, but like soon we'll get like 8K, and then like what happens then? Do we like move on and have like, do I have to buy a 8K copy of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? I will, but yeah. But I think like it is interesting though, like to wrap up, I guess, like this kind of discussion, but like in terms of music, but like cassettes are back, vinyl is back, CDs are even back, and it is interesting with kind of like movies. Like I feel like there are definitely people with like Laserdisc players, and like even like VHS is kind of back, but like Laserdisc has just never really made a comeback, other than to be like for like people who are like super preservationist and like love like probably collect like the Criterion laser discs and like that kind of thing. I feel like more of it as like a collector's item than people like practically watching movies on them, which is interesting.
Yeah, because if you've ever held a laser, they're so fucking cumbersome. They're so massive. They're even like bigger than fucking vinyls, and it's just like Jesus Christ. You have to put this in like the whole movie wouldn't be on one fucking side of this. You have to like flip it over. Fuck that shit. These are so big.
I remember when like I had a very like Gen Z moment, like seeing a Laserdisc for the first time, and I was like, what the fuck is this? Like I've never like how do you even like use this? And like I
only know them basically as like the thing that would be a part of like the big tray that would come out with like the TV at school, where it's just like this thing that we're watching is on a laser
Is
disc.
that what that was? Because
Yes,
sometimes
that's
I remember as a kid they had the TV on the wheelie on the la vainita, like whatever the thing, the table that they would bring the TV, and sometimes they had like this big old machine. That's what that was. Good. Okay. Word.
yes, from a different time,
Yeah.
long ago.
You gotta blow dust off of it. I want somebody to make a movie where there's like a haunted laser disc. I don't think we're tapping enough into like haunted objects of technologies past.
I think you
I
gotta
want the
That's.
call Hollywood. That sounds like call Blumhouse.
I mean, The
or
Ring had the
whatever.
VHS, but yeah, we haven't done the
but
laser disc one.
okay,
That's
but
true.
I so vamos. Like I'm like, okay, we already had a haunted VHS. We've had haunted cell phones, what with one missed call and whatnot. Now we gotta get into it. Now we need haunted laser discs. We need haunted Morse code, like the that's like that. We need those.
Get a haunted DVD where the worst thing about it isn't even like the horror that's on it. It's like, oh, it's in full screen.
Oh
No.
God! It has an unskippable "you wouldn't steal a car" piracy ad that'll kill you if you try to skip it. Like Jason Blum, I'm giving these out for free. You don't even know. You don't even know.
Yeah. Sadly, I do agree. I don't see them potentially releasing like a special Laserdisc edition of whatever movie like they did for like Y2K and stuff like that, where it's like special VHS edition.
Oh, like Alien
for
Romulus.
nostalgia
Yeah,
purposes.
yeah.
Alien Romulus also did that, yeah. But yeah, it is interesting. I just want to close this off by saying one more movie I would kind of put on there because of like what we're talking about is very much key to like film preservation stuff of like so many movies are like streaming like aren't able to have like like physical releases guaranteed. A zany kind of movie that's also just very heartfelt and sweet. I Want a Dolomite Is My Name Criterion release.
Oh hell yes! That's why you're my guy, Thomas. That's why you're my guy.
Such a great movie.
My God, hell yeah! It's a better answer than I had. Jesus.
Well, we've strayed far from Life of Brian.
Sorry.
So why don't we go ahead and do? No, it's cool. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Look, it was a good finale discussion of Criterion in general. But let's wrap up on Life of Brian specifically. Jael, any final thoughts and musings about Monty Python's Life of Brian we didn't mention or anything?
I just think it's fun when something is canonical while still being a good time. Sometimes I have this fear when I go back or when I watch for the first time, something that's been sold to me as like this is capital I important. And then I end up feeling kind of disconnected with it. I don't feel so engaged. I just don't particularly like it. And I find with comedies that happens to me a lot because we've talked about like comedy can be very specific. Comedy can be quick to age and all these things. And there's been plenty of comedies over the course of my life where I'm like told that this is like, oh my God, this is like the high watermark. This is the best. And then I watch it and I'm kind of like nonplussed. And doubly so for something that like was nostalgic, right? Something that I have a connection to as a kid. So it's really good to go back and be like, no, this is still fun. This is still smart. There's still stuff here to dig into. If nothing else, it was a good thing to go back to and just be like, yeah, this is a good time. I'm glad I had an excuse to like go back into it and enjoy myself with it again. Like I'm glad it's on the Criterion Collection, if nothing else, for the same reasons we've been talking about. I hope some obnoxious kid in high school watches Monty Python and makes it their personality. Because then we get more Thomases. It's nice.
You don't want more of those. That's a bad idea. We don't want more of that in the world. Just like that's a plague to put into the world. Brian, what about your final thoughts on Life of Brian? Appropriately, even though different name spelling, we should mention that
It is.
not a B-R-Y as you spell it.
Right, but still, I really, really loved this, and I kind of wasn't expecting to necessarily, just because what Jael was saying. Like, I feel like Monty Python in my head is such a like older thing, from like a completely different generation, that I was kind of like wondering, like, am I gonna like this as much? Is it gonna age poorly? Is it gonna, whatever? And like, no, it's just really funny. There's some absolutely hilarious bits in this. I want to mention a couple that I didn't mention just because this is the place. I love towards the end where we're getting the when everyone's being crucified, or not when everyone's being crucified, but when like all the religious people who are following Brian are like in his house, and they're like trying to guide him through them, and I forget who's like leading him, but is like, all right, now you're possessed by devils over here. Just sit tight, and we'll be right with you. Which I think is just so funny. And also, I've had the movie on in the background, and I just got to the very end credits, and I love this note at the end here. It says, "If you have enjoyed this film, why not go and see La Notte, the Michelangelo Antonioni movie?" Which is so funny to me. And yeah, I mean, like, everything we've been saying, like, throughout, I think is, like, is still true. Like, the fact that, like, again, they're referencing, like, La Notte is so funny to me, as, like, people who clearly are very intelligent about film and comedy and writing and stuff like that, that, like, can create these ridiculous and silly, like, bits that, again, like we've been saying, like, are really, really, really smart. Like, the whole, like, Latin grammar bit is just so stupid, and yet is still about, like, grammar and, like, you know, proper, like, you know, whatever. And so, yeah, I really, really loved this, and I sort of still continue to be kind of just fascinated by Monty Python. I mean, like, just all of what we've been talking about, just this weird collection of people, the fact that they were all kind of, you know, even though we kind of mentioned, like, Cleese and Gilliam being the two slightly more known figures, I think, like, as you've been mentioning, of, like, different people showing up in different places, Eric Idle writing, you know, the song from this movie appearing in so many different things, like, it's just a very weird thing that, like, Monty Python has permeated so much of, like, culture and comedy still to this day. And I think that's really fascinating. And yeah, I agree. Like, even though, like, this is, like, out of print and I have no idea, like, sometimes they'll, like, bring something back that's out of print. Like, I remember, like, for the longest time, as a pretentious, like, high school person, I loved Jean-Luc Godard, and I was so upset that Pierrot Le Fou was always out of print, and I could never watch it because that was like the Godard movie besides, like, Breathless that everyone loved. And, like, they brought that back and re-released it. So, like, they will occasionally do this. So I have no idea if they're even considering bringing this back. But I think it is still cool that in some way it's kind of represented in this collection as, like we've been talking about, like, the kind of curation. Like, hey, if you like Jean-Luc Godard, if you like Kurosawa or whatever, like Fellini, like, we're putting Life of Bryan right next to, you know, La Strada or whatever. And I think that's, like, it's really cool. I really love that. And so, yeah, it's a really, really, really great movie.
Yeah, I do also love with that, you mentioned the end credits thing. Like, I love the voiceover that Eric Idle is also doing while the song's ending. When he's talking, just like, incidentally, this album's available in the foyer. And shit like that. It's so funny that they're able to just inject jokes even into, like, these little corners. That's what I love about Monty Python so much, as somebody who, like, grew up with, like, adoring, like, the Monty Python stuff and, like, really being, like, a diehard. Like, I had to listen to, like, all the albums and watch the shows and watch all the various side projects that these guys did. That's how I ended up getting into Terry Gilliam stuff, and also some of the, you know, other people whenever they would, like, pop up in other things. It's so interesting that, like, it's permeated so much of culture, and so much of it feels like, in theory, it could be very dated, but I think so much of it holds up because of, like we're mentioning, it's the commitment of, like, these 6 guys and the people around them. I think that's another thing, is that, like, these guys are able to do, like, their fun bits so well, but I like that they're able to inject other people who are kind of fun, like John Young, who's, like, the older guy, who's playing the guy who gets accused of, like, who's about to get stoned because of the Jehovah thing, and he's also the guy, like, guarding them from when they're trying to come in. Just, like, listen, Turin's like, oh, my back's out, can't do anything like that. Like, they have guys like that, or even Sue Jones-Davies, who we didn't talk about, who plays Judith, the kind of love interest for Bryan. I love that she's even able to, like, mix it up with these guys once again, while she could easily be shut out. She's able to, like, really feel like she's a part of the same dumb comedic universe, in a way that feels like it's very kind of inclusive in a weird way. But yeah, I like that they're able to, like, have all of, like, their stuff, inject other people into it, able to, like, supplant it into, like, these big, elaborate, like, such a massive movie with, like, these incredible sets, incredible use of locations, and still just have, like, silly, funny, dumb bits in here. And I would say this is still the best Monty Python movie. It wouldn't be the first one I would recommend just because of, like, some of the religious satire and stuff like that. Definitely, Holy Grail is, like, the perfect Training Wheels Monty Python movie. That's, like, the one you introduce everybody to. And it's, like, so much more accessible and so much more, like, inherently, like, silly and quick. as opposed to this one, is dealing with headier subjects, but still does not take itself that seriously whatsoever, which is the real fun of it. And I would say it's the best of these movies. And I think worthy of also being the Criterion Collection in a way that, other silly movies deserve to be. But on that note, let's get into our segment we do for every episode, Between the Lines. So, Between the Lines, Bryan, myself, and a guest recommend a movie that's tangentially related to the one we're talking about today, or could be an alternate choice, in this case for Atypical Criterion. Bryan, you're starting us off here. What is your selection for Between the Lines?
Yeah, so I will try and ring this close to Monty Python. I'm picking another British director, another British film, or collection of films, I should say. Because as we're recording this, I just recently watched Steve McQueen's new film, Blitz, which I thought was really, really great, by the way. But I am recommending his Small Axe series of films that he made that were released in 2020. As I said, Steve McQueen, who, of course, directed films like Hunger, Shame, 12 Years a Slave, Widows, an absolute masterpiece. And Steve McQueen is such an incredible filmmaker, and I think, despite winning for like 12 Years a Slave, I think just does not get enough credit for how incredible of a filmmaker he is, I think. And I think this set of films is such a great example. It's 5 films. They were all released in 2020, which also explains kind of why, not necessarily they feel buried, but they kind of feel like they got lost in that like kind of pandemic wormhole. These are 5 films of various lengths. I think some of them are like over 2 hours, some are like 70 minutes, so different kinds of movies as well. Like all films that deal with specifically Black experiences in the UK throughout history. The first one, Mangrove, is more of like a courtroom thriller. Another one of them is like Red, White, and Blue, starring John Boyega, which is just incredible and deals with like the police and like the nature of police in the UK as John Boyega's character becomes like, I believe, the first Black police officer of the like Metropolitan Police or whatever they call it over there. Or something like Alex Wheatle, which is about this kid who's growing up in the UK and how he gets kind of roped into different kinds of political like upheaval. He gets imprisoned, stuff like that. With all of these movies, I think you get Steve McQueen just doing so many different kinds of movies. I mean, like I think of like something like Mangrove, which like I mentioned is kind of like a courtroom like drama or courtroom thriller, and then like the next one is Lovers Rock, which is just this incredible film, one of the best sequences I've ever seen like of this decade maybe, where it's just this like party and all of these people are dancing, and that specific song, I can't remember the name of that song that plays in that scene, but if you've seen the movie you know what I'm talking about. There's just an incredible sequence of just like community and coming together, and it like just is so incredible. And yet, of course, as like Steve McQueen can do, he does have a lot of these sort of biting commentary, and these movies feel very, very pointed in like what they're speaking about and how they're speaking about a lot of these racial issues. And I just kind of can't get over the fact that Steve McQueen made 5 movies that were released in 2020, and all of them are good. You know, some of them are pretty phenomenal. And I think it's just really great that these are in the Criterion Collection, because especially as I think we've talked about this in previous episodes, but these movies were all put out by Amazon, I believe, on like Prime Video.
Yes.
as we have kind of been talking about, like, these streaming services, these tech companies cannot really be relied upon to deliver us physical copies of these movies that we can, keep forever. And I think it's really great that they have started to do that with, like, obviously a lot of the Netflix stuff like Pinocchio and The Irishman, but also with a lot of the Prime Video stuff. Like, not only have they put this out, but another kind of atypical thing that they've done is the Underground Railroad, the Barry Jenkins Prime Video series that they also put out. So, yeah, I just think it's really great that they can kind of put stuff like this out that gets kind of buried by streaming services and maybe gets kind of like memory hold for a lot of people. And I think that, like, putting it on the Criterion Collection can kind of bring a lot of new people to be like, oh yeah, these 5 Steve McQueen movies, I've never seen these before, and they're all incredible. You'll have a great time with all of them. But yeah, I'm curious, have you guys seen all of these? What's your kind of feel on Steve McQueen? Did you also cry so hard watching Lovers Rock in that one specific sequence I mentioned? Like, yeah, what's your deal?
You mentioned the 2020 black hole of like all that stuff, and I feel bad because Small Axe is one of those things where, like, I know I need to watch it. I know I need to watch them all. I've heard so many good things about Lovers Rock, about like all of them, and I can't. Like, it's so hard to go back to, like, anything that was released in the year 2020 makes me feel like heavy. 12 Years a Slave and Widows are like, 12 Years a Slave is one of those, like, I watched it once, I'll never watch it again. Thank you. Widows is a great movie.
Hell
So I'm excited to see him. Like, I'm excited for Blitz. I would love I love Saoirse Ronan in something good, because unfortunately my good sister is not always in something good. I love her deep, but good lord. So I'm happy to see that he's back. I have to give Small Axe a chance. I need to. There's such a long watch list. My God, guys, everything is so much all the time, all the time.
We would know
But
anything about that.
oh no. But I do. You're just one of the many people. I gotta get to it. I really do, because I think he's very talented. I mean, I love Widows. Like, Widows is one of my favorite movies of the last 10 years. So I definitely got to give that a chance.
I did watch all of these in quarantine around the time that they came out on Prime. Even though we should mention it was a BBC like co-production thing, so they were available on BBC in the UK. And I mean, I think they're all solid. Like, Steve McQueen is one of my favorite directors. He's one of those guys where, like, I didn't realize it until I looked at the whole filmography, and I'm like, oh, there's not a bad movie at all in this bunch. Like, even, I would say Blitz is probably my least favorite movie of his, and that's still a really good movie. That I was like, I still think it's really solid. And yeah, he's definitely, I think, especially with, like you mentioned, like, making all of these within a year, and they're all, like, at least really good. Like, Alex Wheatle, I think, is my least favorite of those, and that's still a really solid like movie. And I think it's definitely a testament to, like, the fact that he's specifically talking about, like, I believe it's the West Indian immigrants in London, and that whole, like, just side of the UK that I wasn't that familiar with at all until, like, watching some of these movies and kind of doing a bit more research on it. And it is, like, fascinating just seeing this entire, like, very specific exploration of a minority group that isn't, like, really talked about as much, at least in the States. And I think, like, all those are really solid. Particularly, I would agree, Lovers Rock's my favorite. I think that's, like, such an amazing movie. That's, like, a great hangout movie that also has just, like, this looming specter of, like, what's literally outdoors. I love how he has that, where it's, like, they're having this party that's basically illegal for them to have, and there'll be just brief glimpses of, like, the cops outside, the white cops, and then we, like, move back into the crowd, and it's just, like, it doesn't, without spoiling things, it doesn't become, like, tragic or anything. It just is, like, a great hangout movie with just this looming specter of, like, this fun is just like an oasis in the middle of, like, a desert for these people. And you just feel that, like, that joy, that release, but also how that results in, like, some pent-up anger that happens with that sort of infighting between certain people. It's a really fascinating movie.
Yeah, I think, like, just with all of these movies, the way he's able to, with a lot of pride, sort of show the lives and the culture and the community that these people have in something like Mangrove, but also, like, absolutely does sort of want you to understand that, like, but there is, like, a lot going against this, and there's a lot of, like, deep rooted and deep seated like racism and just evil going on here. And I think the fact that he's able to do both, and again, not go into a lot of like the tragedy that like I think is part of, I think, the sort of criticism of something like 12 Years a Slave, although that movie is like of course great. But yeah, just the way he's able to do both, to show you the pride and how like amazing the community is, and especially like just again like the music is so fucking good in all of these, and yet he still has a lot of that like just there is a monologue that John Boyega gives at the end of Red, White, and Blue that I will just say, watching this in 2020 when certain things were happening in this country and in the world, I thought was just one of the most like incredible monologues that has just like so much relevancy and feels so like poignant about like what's going on today.
Well, I'll go ahead and recommend my movie, which I think is more in the vein of, like, Jael was asking the question of, like, oh, are there any zany movies in the Criterion Collection? I would argue this movie I'm about to recommend definitely fits into that camp, even though I would say it's a black comedy in many ways. I have 1982's Eating Raoul from director and co-writer / star Paul Bartel, who's a character actor you might recognize from, like, a lot of Roger Corman movies. Bryan, you might recognize him as the guy from Gremlins 2 who's running the theater that the Gremlins destroy.
Oh, yes, okay.
We just show the movies here, we don't make them. Yes. That guy, who very like kind of pompous sort of character type he liked to play a lot. And here it's no exception, because Bartel and his co-star Mary Warnov, the two of them are also like veterans of the Corman School. And Paul Bartel also, he directed Death Race 2000, that's one of his movies, so just a weird element of this, but they play a couple in this movie, him and Warnov, who are trying to, get some money to open a restaurant, and they're having like really bad career slump. He works at a liquor store, and he just bought like a bunch of imported wine to sell that nobody would buy, so he gets fired. And then Mary Warnoff plays a nutritionist at a hospital who's constantly trying to avoid feeding people because she just hates hanging around people in general. And the two of them are in like sort of this slump, and they want to get out of this life. So they end up trying to like sell off some of their items. Like she tries to sell off this wine collection. She tries to get a loan, and they end up getting into like some shenanigans that get them like to like lose a lot of the money that they originally had. So at a certain point, Paul Bartel goes over to like this party that's inside their apartment complex that's full of weird swingers who are into dominatrixes. And he ends up picking up this card for a dominatrix that Mary Warnoff ends up having in her pocket, and people keep confusing her for a dominatrix. So they end up cooking up a scheme, basically, where she will pose as a dominatrix and get rich people to come to their apartment, at which point Paul Bartel will murder them with literally a frying pan to the head, and then steal their money so they can make money to, like, have this whole thing happen. And it ends up resulting in this guy gets involved, Raoul, who initially seems to be like, oh, this like interior decorator guy, but ends up becoming like part of their scheme, played by Robert Beltran, who most people know from Star Trek Voyager, amongst other things. And it's just a really fun kind of John Watersy movie where there's a lot of like pithy back and forth between people. And particularly, I think Bartel and Warnoff are amazing together. Paul Bartel was openly gay, and so you can tell it's much more like a marriage of friendship. Like they show the two of them sleeping in their bedroom, and they're in separate beds. And she's got like stuffed animals, and he has like a giant body pillow, but of like a wine bottle of like a Chateau Merlot or whatever he like sleeps with. It's very silly. It has some admittingly, we talked about some like the dated elements of Life of Bryan. There is some admittingly a trigger warning, some sexual assault stuff that I don't think is quite aged as well necessarily, particularly with the Mary Warnoff character. But she still is like very in charge for most of it. She has this great kind of like, she's very tall and athletic and has this kind of like great back and forth with Bartel, but also has this like command of any scene she's in. She's just like such an underrated actress, I think, in general. And I think there's a lot of fun people that show up in this movie, like Buck Henry, Ed Begley Jr., shockingly playing a meek individual. I know you're all shocked that Ed Begley Jr. would do that. Very outside of his usual casting. But I think it's an underrated gem in the Criterion Collection. I don't think it's necessarily as top tier as Life of Brian is, but if you're looking for other movies in the Criterion Collection that have kind of like a silly atmosphere to them, I think that's a solid bet. I don't know if either of you have heard of this movie.
This is one of those. It's one of those weird things with the Criterion Collection where, like, I have seen this cover many, many, many times, and I've heard the title. I mean, like that's such a title where you're like, what is that movie about? That sounds crazy. And you see the cover, and you're like, whoa, this looks really interesting. What is this? And I've just never gotten around to it. Considering that, like, Criterion also, as we're recording this right now, has a directed by John Waters collection on their Criterion channel right now. I think this might be kind of like, I might pair those with this if it's on there and get a bit into those, because I unfortunately have not seen any John Waters movies, although I know a lot of what his movies are about. I look forward to his favorite movies of the year list every year, and how he fucking loved Joker Folie à Deux. But yeah, I've never seen this, and it sounds amazing from your description of it. So yeah, I would like to see it.
Same. This is one of those that like only exists as like an indelible image to me. So much so that I almost don't want to. I don't want to watch it just for fear of like. But wait, but what if like it's kind of like the Evil Dead? I can't bring myself to watch it. Or Evil Dead 2, I think, is the one that has like the really freaky like skull face cover, where I'm like, I've already imagined so much. I don't know if I want to do that and ruin the mystique. No, but it sounds like a good time. And I'm really bad with like important like surreal comedies and stuff like that. Like it's a big blind spot for me. So who knows? There's, like I said, guys, the watch list is so long. Yeah. It's so long.
That's true. I wouldn't really call this surreal as much as silly. It is very silly. Down to, I just love the fact that the weird sort of like way this movie technically sequelized in other movie, Chopping Mall, the Roger Corman movie, because Paul Bertel and Mary Warnoff appear briefly in that movie as these characters. In a movie, keep in mind, like, Chopping Mall is literally about killer robots who murder a bunch of teens in a mall. And somehow these two characters are in there. Just a weird fact about this movie. But, Jael, what is your recommendation?
So it's pretty bland because we've already mentioned Mel Brooks, and I've mentioned this movie once or twice already in passing. But it must be said. I got to shout out to my dad and my family. Robin Hood Men in Tights. Is it a good movie? Who's to say? You know, I don't know. That's one of those things where I kind of can't separate it from my own personal like relationship with it. A movie that I've watched so much at so many different points with my family. A movie that gets quoted in my house a whole lot. I love Mel Brooks. The way Thomas is about Monty Python, or how Thomas was in high school about Monty Python, that's how I was with Mel Brooks. Like I just think the like throw everything at the wall and see what sticks approach to comedy just really works for me. Because I'm the type of person that will run a joke into the ground if I think it's even just a little bit funny. Robin Hood Men in Tights specifically, I just love Carrie Elwes' performance in that movie. I love so much of how, I love a lot of how he like, it's that Princess Bride thing. He has this way of just like saying the most absurd things in an amusing sort of like light, but it's just his affect, that weird foppish British affect is just so winning to me. It's so funny. Again, there are things that don't age great, but I'm sorry, I can't. I think it's funny. It makes me laugh. I think it's funny. And if we're talking about like absurdist, silly spoofs and things like that, I think, yeah, Robin Hood Men in Tights is so much fun. Obviously, if you want like a canonical great Mel Brooks thing, do Young Frankenstein, do Blazing Saddles. But I like Men in Tights. That's my cross to bear.
I mean, to be fair, Jael, I was also very much like that about the Mel Brooks movies in terms of like my dad definitely had more of that connection that you had with your dad about like Monty Python, where like he showed me like Blazing Saddles, Young Frankenstein, and Spaceballs. Like, Spaceballs was a movie literally that I watched and I was just like, this is legal? You can make fun of Star Wars this way? That's insane. This is like sacrilege. But this was like, I was like British assholes about Life of Brian. Just like, how dare you desecrate the word of Christ? But yeah, I definitely remember seeing like Men in Tights a lot on fucking Comedy Central.
Yep.
They would show like every other fucking day.
Yep.
Like,
And I was there every time.
and I think it's maintained kind of that kind of cable classic status with like a certain like group of people, and I at least remember like really funny bits and pieces of that movie. Like admittingly, like Elwes is so once again committed to that bit with stuff like because unlike certain Robin Hoods, I speak with a British accent and shit like that. It's very funny.
I can
Wonderfully
speak with a
done.
British accent. I love him so much. Carrie Elways is very important to me. Okay, between Men in Tights and Princess Bride, there was a lot happening for me at a formative young age. Okay.
I mean, I get it. Look, and of course, it crossed over to Dr. Gordon in the Saw movies, clearly, because he is clearly an American with his accent.
You know,
God.
or then you get to the Mission Impossible of it all.
Yes.
Oh,
Where
yeah.
he's fighting, where he wants to be friends with the algorithm. I
Who
can't.
doesn't?
Look,
I
I just rewatched Saw like a couple weeks ago, and it is like very interesting. Like I feel like Thomas and I we often reference how Elle was like his accent in that movie specifically, but Lee Whannell is just that accent is hanging on by like
and
not
they're
even a
mostly
thread.
they're most of the movie just the two of
Yes.
them talking with each other. It's just bad
To the
accent
point-
versus
two
bad
to the
very
accent.
point where
American
it's like,
men.
why not just make them British?
Yeah.
Like it gets to a point where you're like, the lady doth protest too much. Just make them British.
It's such a I think Saw is great, and I love both of those two. I support those two gay men, which they absolutely are, and like, but it's just funny to hear Lee Whannell really try to do an American accent, and he just can't do it. But what I will say, I guess I have a slight confession here in front of two Mel Brooks fans, where like I'm not that familiar with Mel Brooks's movies.
Well,
I've watched Young Frankenstein. I watched it like a year or two ago. I absolutely loved it, obviously. I've just never dived into those other movies. Like, I've seen bits and pieces, obviously, from Spaceballs and Blazing Saddles, but I've just never, like, sat down and watched those. Like, nothing like, that, like, I'm scared that, like, they haven't aged well or anything, but, like, I've just never gotten around to them, but I think this is kind of... I think I'm finally going to do it, because hearing you guys talk about Mel Brooks is inspiring.
I mean, look, it's not a perfect track record. You have your Life
Oh, sure.
Stinkses. You have your Dracula's Dead and Loving It. They're not all great, but I
yeah.
think
But when they're great, they're really great.
right. And even like Men in Tights has like really funny bits. Just the other people that are in that movie, even besides freaking Elwes. Like it's an early appearance for Dave Chappelle. Also Richard Lewis, R.I.P. very recently. Tracy Ullman, Isaac Hayes, Patrick Stewart has a very fun cameo in that movie. There's a lot of like good stuff in there. Yeah, I'm curious to revisit because it's been a long time. But yeah, especially having now actually seen the Robin Hood Prince of Thieves and how fucking boring and dumb that movie is, maybe certain jokes will be even funnier to me, like the British accent one and shit like that. But yeah, let's go ahead and just repeat our titles out there for people in case you want to add them to your watch list and all that, Brian.
Yes, I had the Steve McQueen's Small Axe box set from 2020, including, just going to name them real quick, Mangrove, Lover's Rock, Red, White, and Blue, Alex Wheatle, and Education.
And I had the 1982 Paul Bartel silly comedy that's all part of the Criterion Collection, Eating Raoul.
And I had Robin Hood Men in Tights, directed by Mel Brooks.
Shamefully not on the Criterion Collection. That's another one.
Not yet, only because I haven't gotten my way. When I become ruler of the free world, there will be signs.
You're going to move your way up to become CEO of the Criterion Collection. So
Absolutely.
you can get...
The highest position of all.
Or supreme leader of the United States. Whatever's easier to get to first. I'll have my polycule of boys, and I will have my Criterion Collection tended to my tastes. And there will be signs.
Well, I, for one, welcome our Jael overlords.
Exactly.
Look, it can't get fucking much worse. Once again, when we're putting this episode out, things are so low.
I'm so sorry. I keep forgetting when this is supposed to be coming out. I don't mean to make these jokes on purpose.
No, you are the true messiah. We will follow either by sandal or gourd, whichever way. Jael, we will follow you.
I appreciate that.
On that note, we should start wrapping up this episode. We want to thank some people like Burial Grid for our music for the show. Purchase his music at burialgrid.com. Thanks to Michelle Kyle for our artwork. Find her at MishKyle96 over on Twitter. And thanks to our supporters on Patreon, patreon.com/cinema2letter, where for just $1 a month, you all get access to, bonus episodes that we put out and get to vote in polls for stuff. Stay tuned to the end of the episode. We'll talk about a poll you'll get to vote in. That'll come out shortly after this episode. But in terms of bonus stuff that's on there, around this time, we would have hopefully posted, maybe soon, our audio commentary for Total Recall. That's going to be our big bonus episode of January. Wanted to have some fun talking about a movie celebrating its 35th anniversary here in 2025. And also we'll be doing a review roundup like we've done the last couple of months, where we talk about some recent releases, that would have come out in theaters, particularly a lot of like the Oscar holdovers we'll definitely be discussing. And then coming in February, Jael was mentioning all the stuff about like, it's award season and people are going to be, following all the big awards. They got to follow the biggest award possible, Bryan, which is the return, the second annual Los Awards, which we've done on the Patreon previously, the Letters of Cinematic Excellence Awards, where Bryan and I are going to do our own version of the Oscars. We've got our, categories and everything, and it'll be very fun to discuss that, especially here when we're recording this in December. And we haven't even thought about those nominees, I'm sure, but it'll be very interesting. A very good year for movies. So I'll be very curious to see which ones Bryan and I pick.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fun to just go through and pick, like, the best movies of the year. Like, as much as we kind of decry, like, the Oscars and this award season and what people are talking about. But, like, it's been a great year for movies. Every year is a good year for movies. That's my take. So yeah, I'm excited for that.
And that's all available for just the $1 a month, or you can, buy individual pieces of audio for the smallest price available for Patreon, of the $3 for an individual piece of audio. You can find all that, once again, patreon.com/cinema2letter, where you can join the Cineists. That's what we call our patrons over there, the Cineist patrons. But we have one more person to thank. It's our lovely guest, Jael Peralta. Jael, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. Go ahead and, if you have anything to plug yourself. Where can people find you on the internet if you wish to be found?
Allegedly. So first of all, thank you so much for having me on. This has been very, very fun. As you can tell by the fact that I couldn't shut up, I missed doing this. It's 2025 goals. I'm not a resolutions type person, but unfortunately I have ADHD, so I need like finite start points. Because allegedly I am a writer, right? It's been a minute. Life gets in the way. But I'm trying to start to like pick that back up. So, I mean, if you want to find me on Twitter, which I refuse to call it X, you can. I'm at @theshimmer_. That's also my name on Instagram. I think there's a couple more underscores around there. Not that I do much on there anyways, besides just like post weird Instagram stories. But neither here nor there. Allegedly, I'm a writer. You can find any of the stuff that I've written over the years on Film Cred. There's other credits I've got like kicking around places. If you type my name on Google, you'll find it. Some of it in Spanish, which, hey, if anybody cares for that. But yeah, hopefully 2025 shapes up to be a year where I kind of get my act together and learn how to balance a soul-sucking full-time job with this stuff that's like fun and insightful and it's exciting to talk about movies. Movies are fun. Aren't movies great? I love movies, guys. Yeah, so that's that for me.
I'm very glad I could convince you to do this, because I miss podcasting with you, Jael.
So do I.
R.I.P. I guess R.I.P. at this point.
Well, who knows? Who knows? A new year could be full of all sorts of miraculous resurrections. Who's to say? Messiahs and whatnot.
Perhaps. But on that note, you can find us on whatever hell site. We're probably at cinema2letter if we're there. And you can find me specifically more on Blue Sky. I've kind of abandoned the Twitter. I don't envy anyone who decides to continue there. Personally, no disrespect, but also good luck with that. I'm kind of done over there. But I'm on Blue Sky and Letterboxd at Not the Who's Tommy, and occasionally I also do some writing at film-cred.com. And I just want to shout out Bryan and I would have recently been a guest over on the Talk Film Society Oscar show, where friends of the show Marcelo Pico and Siobhan Irving invited us on to talk about makeup and hairstyling and costume design. For those, pick our choices for that. They'll give you a sneak peek at the Los Awards over on the Talk Film Society feed. Always fun to do that with the two of them.
Yeah, as of recording this, we haven't done that, and you just reminded me that we're doing that, and I'm really excited actually. But you can find me on Twitter if you really want, or Blue Sky at BRYANDRADE and the number 3. Or for more consistency, you can follow me on Letterboxd, as I'm getting real deep into, like, this time of the year for me is like catch-up season for me, where I like start to go through all the 2024 movies I've missed. I start to rewatch all the ones I've already seen. I'm going to be seeing Challengers for like the 5th time. I'm so excited. But yeah, you can follow me on Letterboxd for that if you really want to.
And for more of us, subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or other podcasting platforms. If you're listening on Talk Film Society, why not listen to all the other great shows that are on the network? And you can also dig into the archives in our Podbean main feed for the past, 8 seasons of this show, and also the old Double Edge Double Bill stuff, all available over there for you to peruse. And nothing else, if you can't, support us on the Patreon. That's cool, money can be tight. But the free way to help us out is to rate, review, or simply share the show around to give us more visibility. We don't want to be messiahs necessarily. We're both very naughty boys. I don't think we would make great messiahs necessarily. But if you want to spread the word, the gospel of Cinema to the Letter, we do appreciate it. But on that note, we've ended our Criterion season, Bryan. It's time to, pack away the closet and, just journey forward, as we're going to be taking a break until the spring, probably around like March or April. We'll come back with our season 9, which the topic will be in honor of SNL is actually having its 50th anniversary, contrary to any, say, Jason Reitman movies that came out last year that proclaimed it to be the 50th anniversary. No, not until 1975 did that show premiere, so now in 2025, 50th anniversary. And we are celebrating in our own way by doing SNL cast member vehicles as a season topic. So basically, movies that either have at its very center or adjacent to the center people who were SNL cast members as their stars. We'll be doing a full season on that, which should be very interesting. Get into the zany comedy of it all, as we've kind of been talking about with Life of Bryan. And for every season, our patrons over at patreon.com/cinema2letter get to vote in a poll for at least one episode. They get to decide which movie we cover for one episode. And for this season, they're going to pick our E for Egregious, our bad movie for the season. And you all get to choose between 2 very interesting ones, because there's a lot of potential choices for bad SNL movies. But we ended up going with The Cobbler, the Adam Sandler vehicle, versus Bewitched, the Nicole Kidman and Will Ferrell vehicle. Those are your 2 choices. That poll will be coming out tomorrow from the day this episode comes out on January 22nd. And yeah, 2 very odd choices. I don't know, Jael, do you have any thoughts on either of those? Are you even aware what The Cobbler is?
I know what The Cobbler is, but I also know Bewitched was that's not on My Good Sister Nora Ephron. That was made by Satan. That was made by Beelzebub, who took control of Miss Nora, and you applied her tools to witchcraft and chicanery and shenanigans. The Cobbler is that's not a real movie. I know, but Bewitched, it's real. I've been there. I've seen it. It's just, God, I can't, man. Nora, I want oh God. Oh, I'm so sad. If that gives you any idea as to how I feel about Bewitched, I mean,
maybe an endorsement for them to choose it for us. Who knows?
Who knows?
Take
that how you will.
Right. Yeah. I don't know, Bryan. Who are you pulling for? Between these 2.
I've never seen Bewitched, and
honey.
what Jael has just said is not the most inspiring, but
honey.
I don't want to watch The Cobbler again because it's a bad movie. And I love Adam Sandler, but it is a really terrible movie. So I'll ask the Patreon to go with your heart, go with God, whatever you pick.
Right. Go with God for sure. Yeah, especially look, there are plenty of bad Sandler movies we could have picked. We at least picked the weirdest one.
That's true. Yeah,
The most bizarre fucking one.
could have been Grown
We
Ups.
could have picked. That's true. It could have been Grown Ups or Grown Ups too. But those are your two choices, patrons. Please choose wisely, and we'll find out that one along with whatever other SNL movies we'll be covering next time. But until then, like we mentioned, this episode's coming out at a bad time. But even if it is a bad time, everybody, you should always look on the bright side of life.
Boo!
This podcast episode's available in the foyer.
Oh no. Yeah. Maybe we all need to be crucified.